will develop topics about democracy, starting with associate professor, assistant professor Nenad Stojanović to my right, who comes to us all the way from Switzerland, from Geneva, University of Geneva. He will be developing a non-populist model of direct democracy, which is a very ambitious title, to say the least. So the floor is yours, Nenad.
Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, Ioannis, for your kind invitation. Alex for his kind assistance in the last days. It was not so easy to organize everything. So thanks a lot. I will present here a project on which I've been working in the past 2-3 years, which is about non-populist direct democracy. So first of all, let me say, what do I understand by populism? There are many definitions around, and especially in the past years, there have been a lot of publications. So let me try to focus on what has been considered in the literature, the minimal definition of what populism is. And it's based on the two core elements of populism, that on the one hand, populist movements, populist leaders have this anti-elitist discourse. Of course, we know that, but it's not sufficient. Being against elites is not necessarily something bad for democracy, but the problem is the second element. They have an anti-pluralist conception of democracy. Anti-pluralist, I mean, they have a unitary idea of people as a single whole. You know, there is the people. That does not really allow for pluralism within the idea of people. And so as I wrote on this slide, populism is not necessarily something negative. It can be something, you know, populist party can be something that gives voice to people who are perhaps excluded or feel excluded from politics, do not participate in elections, and then they find some expression in populist parties. So it's not necessarily negative, but the combination of these two elements, anti-elitism and anti-pluralism, is problematic for democracy, and especially for the liberal conception of democracy, because it can undermine some important values of democracy, like protection of minorities. Because if you have a unitary conception of people, then your conception doesn't really allow that there are minorities within your people, and that's especially a problem for populism of the right, which, contrary to the populism of the left, the unitary conception of the people is also an ethnic conception of the people. So, as we know, there has been in the past years a lot of publications on populism, because there has been a lot of new populist parties and movements in many parts of Europe and the world. I think also in this country as well. And so this rise of populism has been often put together with the idea that democracy is in crisis. This idea that, especially representative democracy, the traditional political parties are in crisis, and so there should be something done something that you can see at least in some countries every now and then. For instance, in Italy, every time that an elected government is not able to fulfill its functions, is corrupted, etc. The president would appoint a technician as a prime minister, and this technician would typically appoint a technocratic government. So the idea, let's get rid of these politicians, let's have people who know what they are talking about to be ministers, etc. And then this is again something that lasts until the next election, and then it starts all over again. So the one answer is less democracy, but there is another answer, and I'm much more sympathetic to that answer, to say that the crisis of democracy should be addressed by more democracy, by empowering or providing new channels for political participation. It is in this context that there is also a quest for more direct democracy. And I will say in a second what do I mean by direct democracy. So by direct democracy, I do not mean the ancient Greek style democracy where people would gather on the square and take decisions by raising hands. We don't know if that was really the case, but that's the kind of image we have. And actually something of this kind still exists in some parts of Switzerland for some local elections. What I mean is by direct democracy is a system that does not take place of, that does not eliminate, of course, elections and parliaments. So you still have representative democracy, but this representative democracy is kind of complemented by the institutions of direct democracy, by which I mean the use of referendums or popular votes. But the puzzle is that saying that direct democracy is something that can address the problem of the crisis of democracy is potentially misleading or problematic, because it is actually precisely the populists themselves in almost most countries, at least that I know. I don't know in Greece, but in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Sweden, in UK, etc. The populist parties are those that say we need direct democracy, we need referendums, we need people to decide directly. So, how can the problem of crisis democracy and the problem of populism can be solved by having more direct democracy if direct democracy is actually what populists want to have? And this thesis that direct democracy is actually something that enables populism and can favor populist movements is also something that you will find in the mainstream literature on democratic theory, where most, if not almost all, authors are very skeptic and very critical of direct democracy, of the use of referendum. So basically, what I try to defend or let's say discuss with you during this talk is that direct democracy is not necessarily populism enabling. It can actually be problematic for populism. But there are some preconditions. For instance, it's important that referendums take place in a bottom-up fashion and not top-down, which means that in order to have a referendum, you need to collect signatures. So citizens themselves can organize and collect signatures and put a veto by, or call for a referendum against a decision taken by parliament. Or they can even start so-called citizens' initiatives, called popular initiatives as well, by demanding some amendments to constitution or some particular laws. Second, if these signatures are collected, it should trigger, in the end of the process, a popular vote, especially if the parliament or the government do not accept what a popular initiative, for instance, asks for, then in the end, the people decides. And this is important because you do have some forms of, let's say, direct democracy, for instance, at the level of the European Union. The European Citizens Initiative, some of you are certainly aware, is something that is allowed since the Lisbon treaties. But, it demands a huge effort, 1 million signatures spread in at least 8 countries, a huge effort. And in the end, the European Commission and the European Parliament can say, we accept it or we do not accept it. But if they don't accept it, nothing happens in terms, there is no popular vote in the European Union on this popular initiative. So that's the reason why this instrument of European Citizens Initiative is very rarely used after some initial enthusiasm, is not so often used. And then it's important to have not one referendum once every 10 years, as more or less in France, the UK, for instance, but to have a frequent referendums, typically many times every year. And finally, that before the popular vote, there's a possibility for deliberations to discuss about the topic inside the parliament, but also outside the parliament. For instance, within the so-called mini-publics. I will say something more about mini-publics later on. So let me now present why do I think that direct democracy can be non-enabling for populism. There's a couple of ideas here. The first idea is that frequent use of referendums structurally produces a situation with unstable majorities and minorities, which means that every single voter, democratic voter, will be on some issues in the majority, in others in the minority. But you are never always a winner or always a loser. I made this exercise for myself once as a Swiss citizen, voting very frequently, or always basically. It's more or less 50-50. In about 50% of decisions I'm in the majority, and 50% I'm in minority. And perhaps sometimes when you have, on a single day, you have 2 or 3 referendums. On a single day, you can be, on two issues in minority, and in one I'm majority, or vice versa. For instance, in last November, we had 3 referendums. I think I was in 2 of them in majority, in 1 of them minority, or something like that. Okay. And the fact is that mainstream theorists of democracy consider this unstable majority as a problem of direct democracy, whereas I see it as a crucial in a non-populist account of direct democracy, because it increases the likelihood that the members of minority will be part of political majorities, at least on some issues. And this is important because it goes against this idea of a unitary idea of people that populists have. Connected to this discussion, there's also the concept of losers' consent that is important for stability of democracy, because empirical studies show that direct democratic institutions are associated with, I quote, higher levels of citizen satisfaction with democracy, and together with consensus cabinets that are also sometimes linked to direct democracy, they can close this gap in satisfaction with democracy between losers and winners of elections by comforting losers and reducing the satisfaction of winners. And again, this is important, and this is important because it shows how direct democracy can address a crisis of democracy, a lack of trust towards elected politicians, and in a way also undermine populist demands for strong leader who will decide everything, etc., because the satisfaction is with the democracy tends to be higher if you have a frequent use of direct democracy. But let me now, how many minutes do I have?
So I think we can have 4 minutes.
Okay. So the idea is that, to sum up, that a frequent and regular use of direct democracy structurally, and that's important, structurally undermines populist ideology, which is based on the people's will and the unified non-pluralist conception of the people. We know, of course, that this conception is a fiction, but my argument that it's easier to unmask it in a political system in which direct democracy is frequently used and produces multiple majorities and minorities. In other words, it's easier for a leader, populist leader in a country where you don't have possibility of a referendum to say, our people is against immigration. I know what the people want, But if you never ask the people what the people want, it's easier. But if you ask the people what the people want, well, perhaps the people will have a different opinion on a number of issues. Second, the direct democracy also enhances the formation of a common demos and contributes to the formation of a common political identity. And the kind of demos that direct democracy brings about is not the people unified non-pluralism that populists have in mind, but rather a plural political community that societies need in order to have a functioning democracy. And this is conception of people is closer to Claude Lefort's, for instance, idea that in a democratic regime, the people is multiple and therefore, as he says in French, infigurable. So, to conclude, a lot of what I said will depend on the details, on institutional details. How do you really design a direct democracy in a specific country? In other terms, as with representative democracy, you need some checks and balances. Okay, so I don't have time to go into the different solutions, but you can have a solution based on the quorums, a threshold of participation in order to have a referendum validated. I'm against it personally because it has some perverse effects, but it has been at least mentioned in literature as one of these checks and checks. You might have a provision to have qualified majorities for certain very important decisions, or in order to avoid majority tyranny against minorities on specific issues, you can have the rule of qualified majority. There's a question whether or not compulsory voting is something that will help as well. Compulsory in terms of something you have in Belgium or Australia, so you pay a fine if you don't go to vote. Perhaps we should have judicial review of popular initiatives to check if they are in accordance with the constitution, something that Switzerland doesn't have, by the way. And actually the thing on which I've been working in the past 2 years within this larger project is the use of mini publics, of these deliberative mini publics. You've heard something about that in the keynote yesterday, which was in Greek, so I didn't come. But I saw the title. It was about mini publics at the European level, so you are familiar with that. And just briefly, there is one model of mini publics that is particularly interesting in this non-populist idea of direct democracy, which is the Oregon model, where mini publics are of about 20 citizens who are selected via petition, take place about 3 months before a popular vote, before a referendum. They discuss the topic of the referendum, and they write a short report that is then sent to all voters in the state of Oregon, where they kind of sum up the topic of the discussion, and they say, what are the reasons to vote yes and what are the reasons to vote no. And there are some empirical studies that showing that within these mini publics, populist proposals might have a majority within a mini public at the first day, but after the 4 days of deliberation, when people understand the complexity of the topic, typically a populist proposal does not have majority anymore. So the big challenge is how to connect the results of these mini publics with a greater public in a popular vote, and that's where I think this Oregon model, so-called citizens initiative review, is particularly promising. And I'd be happy to say more if there are any questions on this later on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Stojanović. It was very intriguing. Unfortunately, I wanted more. I wanted to hear more. I'm just pointing out one probable topic for discussion. Is the following: that you said that one of the great things about direct democracy is that it shakes to the ground the presupposition that the people is unitary. This, Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of understanding of people as being one and not tolerating minorities and so on. And then, of course, you went on to say that one of the basic preconditions, if not the most basic, is to insert some occasion for deliberation previously to the popular vote in any sense, referendum or other. Now, the thing is that what happens with deliberation, which is, of course, a very interesting topic, is that it aggregates votes much more than if it didn't exist. Deliberation in our empirical studies always shows that people who enter the mini-public, selected on sortition, who enter without knowing something about the topic, and after having discussed, debated, and worked together on a topic with the aid of experts, normally form rather compact majorities. I mean, they're normally more in favor of one of the other solutions, which means that probably, this is food for thought, of course, the use of mini-publics before referendums and report to the voters probably might congregate more votes, which means that statistically, it would become less frequent for people to find themselves half and half evenly shared between majorities and minorities. Just think about that. So I'm not opening the discussion right now. Thank you. So now the floor is to Eleftheria Terzoudi to my left, who is the PhD candidate at the University of the Aegean, under the supervision of my beloved professor, Panagiotis Grigoriou. So she is going to talk to us about active citizenship, strengthening or questioning modern democracy.
I'm sorry, does anyone check for the Zoom? Because it says 2 people are waiting to enter the Zoom.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Eleftheria Terzoudi. I'd like to say that I'm really glad to be here. I'd like to express my thanks to the co-organizers for giving me the opportunity to share with you my passion. My passion is citizenship, in particular active citizenship, a conception quite recently appeared in the academic field. Yes? Can you hear me now? Okay. So what I started saying is that my passion is citizenship, and in particular, active citizenship. And that's because I think that this quite new in the academic field conception has lots of dynamics hidden inside. However, just before I start my presentation, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. I think that you all can admit that discussions about citizenship, about the role of citizen in the modern society, are very common. Richard Bellamy put it really nicely when he said, whatever the problem, be it the decline in voting, increasing numbers in teenage pregnancies, or climate change, someone has canvassed the revitalization of citizenship as part of the solution. But all this noise around this core concept of our society, the concept of citizenship, make it perhaps even more important to shed light to the content of this multidimensional world. So let's start from citizenship. Citizenship requires a certain abstraction and sophistication of thought. A citizen needs to understand that his role entails status, a sense of loyalty, the discharge of duties and the enjoyment of rights, not primarily in relation to another human being, but in relation to an abstract concept, the state. I have chosen to start with these Dirk Hitter's words because I'd like to underline something. Citizenship is a construction. It didn't pre-exist. Citizenship has been created by human. People, by becoming citizens, chose to share political equality. They chose to form a community of citizens and be self-ruled. This community of citizens was named in ancient Greek demos, and their polity has been named democracy, the power of people, or more specifically, the power of citizens. Although nowadays might seem difficult to imagine a world in which no one has heard the word democracy, indeed, once upon a time, democracy, there was not such a thing. It didn't exist. The appearance of democracy had two preconditions, needed two things to happen. Needed the invention of a new political actor, demos, and needed the embracing of a new conception of politics, what was named in ancient Greek takina, the common affairs. Hannah Arendt explains that in democracy, public space is created for the first time in history. And that happens because of general participation in politics. Politics are not anymore a private affair. It's not an affair of a king, of the priests, of the politicians, of the experts, of bureaucracy. Decisions on common affairs have to be made by the community of citizens, by demos. But how did this happen? We could say that the crucial element which allowed to construct demos itself as political actor was deliberative politics. Sheldon Walling interestingly supports that the construction of demos originates from a gradually developed self-consciousness about common powerlessness and its causes. Demos, he says, is created from a shared realization that powerlessness comes from being shut out of the councils where power's authority is located. The demos becomes political not simply when they try to shape, to make system of governance more responsive to demos' needs, but when it attempts to shape the political system in order to enable itself to emerge, to make possible a new actor, an actor collective in nature. Consequently, nothing would have happened if people at that time hadn't believed that change was feasible. Citizens in ancient Greece initially had to gather their power from outside the system. They had, through their collective action, to question tradition. According to Cornelius Castoriadis, people, by questioning tradition, allowed them to move towards a new self-institution of society, towards a new polity, with a new image of the world. When Thucydides says that demos is autonomous, autodicus, autotelous, self-legislating, self-judging, self-governing, he describes the outcome of an acute break with tradition, the outcome of a break with status quo. That new image of the world, that new polity, democracy, which was initially introduced in ancient Greece, still survives, though in different form, in modern society. Despite all the transformations that have taken place through time, and I really hope that we'll have perhaps the chance to talk about them in another meeting, democratic citizenship is still projected in modern society as the mean which allows sharing of political power on an equal basis. Therefore, we can describe citizenship using the words of Richard Bellamy, but citizenship is a condition of civic equality. It consists of membership of a political community where all citizens can determine the terms of social cooperation on an equal basis. This status not only secures equal rights to the enjoyment of the collective goods provided by the political association, but also involves equal duties to promote and sustain them, including the good of democratic citizenship itself. Please take under consideration how often we see the word equality being used. And there is a paradox of citizenship. Democracy is based in equality of citizens. Κοινωνία ομοίων, in Aristotle's words, equality of citizens that ensures the same access to the advantages of membership of a given political community. In each democratic political community, cohesion is built in shared equality, shared intimacy, solidarity and reciprocity, and in shared sense of belonging. But at the same time, democracy, more than other regimes, allows people to manifest themselves. Democratic citizenship asks for individual civic action. Citizenship represents the right of people to claim rights in a certain political community. However, this right is being preserved only through individual political participation. So we have two dimensions, one of equalization of citizens and one that pushes citizens to become apparent, to manifest themselves. But what happens if we don't have the latter? When there is no active citizenship? Because vibrant democracies require active citizens, both inside and outside the political system, to monitor the process and to be willing and able to act, to create or resist change. Having in mind these words of Bernard Crick, I chose to present you a painting. This painting is named Oppression, Καταπίεση. The painter, Ioannis, is known for these repeating men dressed identically in hats and plaid jackets, jackets that may bring in mind prison uniforms. Throughout his work, these figures represent the men of the modern society, alone in crowd, homogeneous, interchangeable. I'll use the artist's words. He was saying, I'd like very much to explain my work. There are experts doing this, but I think it's more my right to talk about the little men. This wooden one, of course, but yet real little men. They are little men of present times. They are the status quo. And this same little man reacts to status quo. Today, he says, I make the little man. I don't have the power to change it because the little man represents me in total. Now, whether people like my work or not, is another discussion, because people don't want to look themselves as being little men, because they'll say, I'm not a little man, but yet they are. So in this painting, we see the outcome of inaction, of passiveness, of alienation, of massification. And let's return to the resistance to the above little men. Let's return to the concept of active citizenship. According to Brian Hoskins, active citizenship is participation in civil society, community, and/or political life, characterized by mutual respect and non-violence and in accordance with human rights and democracy. Given this definition, there are limits in active citizenship, which are defined by ethical boundaries. Being active doesn't automatically mean that you act in favor of democracy. Hitler supporters used to be really active, but surely not particularly democratic. Furthermore, in the above-mentioned definition of active citizenship, we don't find the idea of conflict. This remark generates certain questions or perhaps challenges. So we might wonder, when we refer to active citizenship, what are the limits in political action? Which forms are citizens' intentional actions entitled to take? Finally, can citizens question tradition in the way Castoriadis put it when he described the birth of democracy? I mean, can citizens move towards a new self-institution of society, towards a new polity, perhaps with a new image of the world? That's something that we have to answer if we want to give our perspective to what an active citizenship means, an active citizen does. For me, I've chosen to deal with these questions by using a photo. For those not Greeks, I'd like to say that red carnation, seen in the photo, and in this case also the doll, are tribute to the students that stood up against the Greek military dictatorship of 1967-1974. In November 1973, an uprising occurred in Athens, political institution. The uprising began on 14th of November 1973, escalated to an open revolt, and ended in bloodshed in the early morning of 17th of November, after a series of events starting with a tank crashing through the gate of the Polytechnic. So every year on November 17th, people bring red carnations to the Polytechnic gates. I chose this photo for two reasons. From one point of view, this photo brings to my mind that all through history, active citizens are the defenders of democracy. However, at the same time, this doll at the picture becomes a symbol for me. Some child wrote the word democracy, and he wrote it with trembling letters. And this doll, carrying the word democracy, has its face hidden. And the body of the doll is created by using collage technique. And around the doll, red flowers on a rustic gate of an educational institution. Food for thought for me, a picture. But to conclude, in my opinion, the possible transformation of democracy that might occur in the future cannot really be predicted. However, I do believe that all citizens, and especially young ones, need to visualize the shape of democracy they desire. We all need to fight against the little man inside us we were talking about previously. We need to become active citizens, capable of deliberative politics. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Terzoudi. It was a very interesting sort of synthesis of an outline of democratic theory. I just have one point for you to consider. You shouldn't, I think, you shouldn't uncritically adopt the claim by Cornelius Castoriadis that democracy and autonomy were made possible in ancient Athens, in ancient Greece, if you want, through a break with tradition. He insists on that. You said it twice. Not only I, but other people as well, better than me, think this is probably wrong, because when we talk about tradition in ancient societies, and less today as well, we mostly talk about religion, actually. But religion, as Hannah Arendt beautifully showed in a great book of hers, comes from religare, which means bind together, cohesion, bind a group together. And religion in ancient Athens, that is totally for sure, was not something that democracy should have to break with to impose itself. On the other hand, I mean, totally inversely, it was a kind of background culture, John Rawls says, on which actual democracy was based. Religion was a precondition of democracy. for many reasons that it's not the time and place to expound. So we should be very cautious and careful on this relation between tradition and democracy. That was just a point to consider. So, okay, thank you. Now, I think that Daniel, my dear friend Dániel Oross is somewhere virtually behind me from Budapest. Hello, Dániel, are you there? Can you see us? Can you hear us? Okay, can you recognize me? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, and sorry for the technical problems. It seems that if I share, I have difficulties to mute or unmute myself. So yes, I'm here, and thank you for the invitation to the conference.
Okay, so Dániel Oross, who is a research fellow at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest. He's also a dear friend of mine. I was in Budapest a couple of months ago, and it was fantastic. Will talk to us about a real democratic experiment on, he'll talk to us about the quite famous now in Europe, Budapest Climate Assembly. So Dániel, you have the license to proceed.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you can see my slide and it is going to work properly while I share them. So thank you very much for the invitation. And as Ioannis just mentioned, I'm going to present about active citizenship in a different manner, active citizens of an institutional design called the Citizen Assembly. Citizen Assembly that was held in Budapest in September 2020. And so if my slide will work properly, then I hope that, sorry, still it seems that when I share and when I present, it's just not in some kind of harmony. So hopefully this will.
Dániel, you can
now you can see that,
yeah, you can leave it without presenting, just leave the PowerPoint slides and then you can proceed with that if that works better.
Okay, I mean, yeah, if somebody can just double check if my presentation works or not. For some reason, this is just not in total parallel process. So once again, I just start sharing my screen and hopefully. So now you should see my introduction, which is telling about the actual case that we are talking about now. So the case is the Budapest Citizen Assembly that was organized by the City Council in cooperation with the NGOs, both from Hungary and from international level. And if we look at the literature, what they typically write about the reasons why such assemblies occur, we see 5 very big potential drivers. So one is, like, of course, the potential interests of the promoters, then some ideology behind promoting such events, creating local identity. I will also mention a case about this from the Belgian context. The pursuit of broader economic interest for community. As we will see, there was also some behind in the organization of this Citizen Assembly in Budapest, and the desire to ensure sustainability, of course, because we are talking about a very specific Citizen Assembly on climate change. So in my paper that I was writing together with Sergio Gergina and my colleague Esther Mátyás, actually we based our empirical analysis on policy documents of different political parties and political actors, and we also conducted interviews with organizers in order to reveal what were actually the drivers behind the organization of this event, why this climate change, Citizen Assembly on Climate Change was actually organized. So hopefully, okay, so now it moves. So just a very brief question: why citizen assemblies are actually organized in general? What does the literature tell us, and what are the, let's say, the biggest examples from the literature? So one of the very famous one is the Citizen Assembly of British Columbia, where citizens discussed about an electoral reform. And there the promoters were leaders of political parties who were unable to fix the topic of the electoral system with political means. So they decided to invite citizens to help them, and also experts and activists to design an electoral law that fits the interest of the county. And of course, the reasons were electoral pledges, greater visibility, and electoral support. And of course, yes, a very big reason was that the political system needed a reform, and politicians didn't want to do it by themselves because they wanted to create more legitimacy to this process. Another very interesting example is the German-speaking minorities' permanent citizen assembly in Belgium, which is actually a new institution and a permanent institution that they created a citizen assembly next to the regional parliament, and it has a new function in the citizen in the political system. It helps to create a kind of specific identity of the territory, and also helps local politicians to connect better to their citizens. Another issue is when politicians, academics, and citizens cannot agree on a topic. We saw it in the case of the Irish Citizen Assembly, where there were very, very controversial policies like same-sex marriage or abortion, where actually citizens wanted to have a say, and politicians didn't want to decide on their own. Again, the question of legitimacy was there, and so a nationwide citizen assembly was organized in order to find a solution and to find an ideological match between politicians and the citizens, and to define the actual policy on that. And of course, we saw that the Irish constitution was changed regarding that. And the final very broad topic around that citizen assemblies are organized nowadays is climate change. And for that, I created a specific slide just to get some insight for us why, what are the biggest examples. So, for example, the climate change citizen assemblies were also part of the Irish Constitutional Convention, as I mentioned, and it turned out that actually citizens are not only able to discuss about such a complex issue, but they were much more radical than politicians expected. So they came up with 13 policy recommendations that puts Ireland to the map of in a leading role of fighting climate change. Also, we saw the French president inviting citizens, 150 citizens in frame of the great national debate to talk about the climate change. And also there, we saw that actually citizens were able to come up with 149 proposals, like a huge numbers of proposals. And this case shows us that soft law can also have a more important role in the French legislation since this debate happened. So again, the political system changed a little bit thanks to this National Citizen Assembly. And just a final example from national level, the Climate Assembly of UK that was convened by the Parliament, the UK's Parliament, and it aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And again, here citizens were very active and very effective in coming up with solutions and proposals. So this is, let's say, the context or the environment in which the local citizen assembly in Budapest happened. And now I will turn to this exact case just to give you a brief overview about the why question. So why it occurred and how actors saw their role in initiating and organizing this local level citizen assembly. Again, just very quickly and briefly, so it was organized about a year ago, 2020, in September, and the 50 randomly selected citizens were invited to better understand the issue of climate change and to suggest potential solutions for the municipality. the selection process was quite typical or similar to how it should be organized. So there were random invitations, randomly selected citizens. 10,000 residents of Budapest received a letter from the mayor of Budapest to take part in this citizen assembly. And of course, not all invited citizens replied. About 3-4% of citizens replied positively to this invitation. So during the second step of the selection process, those ones who replied positively were screened by Sortition Foundation and Nemnet, the two main organizer NGOs, to be able to select a sample of citizens that is representative by gender, education, place of residence, and also regarding this very, very important representativity issue. This enables politicians to be sure that those who participate in the citizen assembly actually represent in some sense the whole society. So it's not just about those 50 participants, but about the bigger sample of society. So that's why the second step of the selection process was needed and very important. And finally, out of those 50 participants who were exactly selected and invited to take part, in person at the assembly, 93 people attended the Budapest Climate Assembly. Again, as the sample was representative of the society, the typical problem of dropping out occurred, unfortunately. So some people couldn't make it in the very, very last moment. So even if the organizers were able to sort out the very active citizens, life sometimes changes plans, especially because actually this citizen assembly happened just in the middle of the pandemic. So this causes also some difficulties in organizing the citizen assembly. But actually, it was an effective process. The participants of the Climate Assembly were able not only to learn from experts about the very complex topic, but they were also able to come up with recommendations to the city council. So the first weekend was about lectures of different topics, and then citizens during the second weekend had the chance to measure which topic they consider to be the most important. So finally, they came up with 8 topics: climate change, energy use of households, transport and climate change, health and climate change, sustainable rainwater management, green surfaces, social adaptation, and visions about the future of Budapest. And during the last day, they were also formulating recommendations, so policy solutions that could be implemented to the city's sustainability and climate change plan. So these 8 recommendations that finally were recommended by the participants consist mostly of social questions regarding social adaptation and green surfaces, but there were also solutions about rainwater management, transport and climate change, energy use, and a very general solution regarding climate change. So, but here again, what I want to focus on is the drivers. So why this Climate Assembly was convened? We see that on the one hand, the city was about to renew its climate strategy. So it was very, very useful for the city council to have this discussion process, because those recommendations that I just mentioned were directly included into the draft proposal of the document. And the final version of the document was accepted, including these 8 solutions. Economic reasons were also quite huge, because the municipality of Budapest is very much interested in the European Union's Green New Deal. So this new strategy is in line with those aims. And of course, if the climate strategy is in line with the EU's Green New Deal, then of course there's a much more chance of European funds to be invested well in the city and invested in line with the EU's aims and those goals that are promoted. And the third reason is the combination of election pledges, ideological match between topic and the assembly, and citizen participation as a value that is very much valued by the new leadership of the Budapest City Council. I think I will come back to this when I present the documentary analysis and the interviews. But these are, let's say, the three core findings of the qualitative research. So regarding civil society and political institutions, interviews revealed that it was very interesting that in this case, actually, it was the civic organizations, NGOs, that came up with the idea of organizing the citizen assembly, and the city council was reacting. In many cases, we see much more a top-down process where politicians organize and invite the NGOs. In this case, there was a founder who gave money to these NGOs that I mentioned. And of course, the topic was also chosen by the founder. And then these NGOs were thinking about how to invite citizens, and then found the city council as a possible place to organize this meeting. So it was really a bottom-up process. And as one interviewee said, for us, it was important to organize it before the fall of 2020, because the municipality was working on changing or adapting the climate strategy. So here we see a kind of match between the NGO's aims and the needs of the municipality. Before I jump to the conclusions, one more thing that I wanted also to emphasize it. That also the municipality was eager to communicate its plans and its strategy to the people. So also there was the kind of communication needs of the city council, and that's why it was also good for dissemination purposes of the city council to organize this specific event. So proceeding towards the conclusions, what we can see from this example is that quite similar to what the literature says, here a combination of election pledges, ideological match, pursuit of economic interest, and the desire to achieve environmental sustainability were the core drivers of organizing the citizen assembly at local level. And so yeah, just to highlight, the elected mayor of Budapest belongs to the Green Party, and of course this ideological position and also this economic interest of the EU that it is promoting the Green New Deal was particularly in line what the mayor wanted. So decision about organizing this participatory event was a bottom-up process. So NGOs came and with the idea, but the fact that actually it could take place in Budapest very much happened because of this also ideological match and election pledges of the new mayor of Budapest. What I would like to end this discussion or this presentation with is that the very specific bottom-up approach of this Budapest Citizen Assembly. So as I mentioned in my presentation, usually politicians think of an institution and then invite NGOs. In this case, it was the other way around. So NGOs had the project and then approached the politicians and especially in this case, the mayor of Budapest to organize this Citizen Assembly. And this is very interesting that although it was started from an NGO or two NGOs, it became part of the decision-making of Budapest. And we are just about the phase of second citizen assembly organized in Budapest, about in frame and as part of the conference on the future of Europe. So it seems that this institution will become also a kind of permanent institution of the Citizen Assembly of Budapest. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry again for these technical problems that occurred. I hope that you could hear and see my presentation properly. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Daniel, for the presentation of this qualitative analysis. So now, without any further delay, I would like to give the floor to the public for possible questions. You'll have a microphone somewhere in front of you, so you can use it. Don't be shy.
Good morning. Thank you very much, all the three speakers, for your interventions. I would like to extraordinarily congratulate Professor Stojanović because he gave a very thought-provoking intervention, a paper that gives us a lot of food for thought. I am very much in favor and in the same lines with what you said and how you argued. I would like to pose a further question concerning the functioning of the social media nowadays, and how do you see that the functioning of the social media or of the internet altogether, the fact that they allow for these so-called echo chambers where somebody says something and then you have it multiplied, not only by persons, actually, by physical persons, but also by bots or anything, and how these technological possibilities you think that they can interfere with a more authentic formation of the political will of the people when it comes both to elections. Of course, these play a role also in the classical representative democracy, but maybe even more if we had more institutions of direct democracy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's a really a great question. Of course, the question that goes beyond, as you said, question of direct democracy. It's a generally speaking, something that is interesting to consider when we speak about democracy, the role of social media and the echo chambers, etc. I don't think that I have a ready-made answer to that, apart from the fact that I do agree that generally speaking, these bubbles, echo chambers are a problem. I would just say that they are not only a problem in connection with social media. It's a general problem that we all have because, we all have people that we see on a daily basis who tend to be like us, to think more or less similarly or with some small differences. But we, like we academic community, are we really connected to working people, to people who would go to some bars and restaurants that we don't go into, etc. You see what I mean? And that is a general problem. So we need to find spaces where we break these bubbles, where we break these echo chambers. And one of the interesting things that I have learned by conducting these citizens' assemblies in Switzerland, I actually started the very first one 2 years ago, and by now we have organized 5 of them. Next year we will organize 4 of them. So I was very interested to listen to the colleague from Budapest as well. One of the interesting findings is really that thanks to the way how these assemblies are selected through sortition, etc., you do have people coming together that come from very, very different backgrounds. That's something that you do not have, or much less so, in a typical parliament, elected parliament. So in our citizens' assemblies, you have people with high education, with no education, people, sometimes also people who cannot read properly or use communication technologies, etc. People who are who do not work, they are on chômage, how do you say, the unemployment, etc., etc. And this is really what I found most fascinating, how they are able to to deliberate in a very constructive, civilized manner, and in the end of the process come up with a text that sums up the conclusions of what they have done. And that is really, when you read it, something it's really good work behind that. But I thought if we had some kind of in future of democracy, as also you mentioned about active citizenship, etc., when we had more of these, when these citizens' assemblies become institutionalized, as in Belgium and the German-speaking communities as the first place in Europe, if we have a lot of them, it would be a lot of people involved every year, and breaking these echo chambers could be something to be done by using citizens' assemblies. And by the way, and I conclude on this, there's also a lot of thinking and some experiments with online assemblies, how and can it work online, etc. Actually, in Switzerland, and in connection with some colleagues who have a research project on online deliberation, we will try in September to have like two parallel processes on the same topic of a given referendum, but one assembly will be online, the other will be in presence, and then we'll try to compare the results.
Thank you. It's very good. Yes, so it obviously is the structuring force of the quasi-institution of public deliberation. The forum is always already, an institution which structures people, and people become more serious, actually. Mm-hmm. It's not only about different social backgrounds. This may also be the case in social media, but there's no structuring force whatsoever. Okay, so any other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, this also go mostly to Nenad, but maybe it's a bit combining the three papers. I was wondering, when you were talking about that, the direct democracy should come bottom up, which makes sense. At the same time, we heard by Dániel now, while this was a bottom up procedure there, it was, well, at least the context was shaped by parties. And I think you can also, as a political party, you can use and abuse somehow this bottom up procedure. So I would be interested in your experience with that, maybe. Also with regard to this, what you mentioned with active citizens who are not necessarily democratic citizens. I thought this is very important. These are two different things. And the second question was, you mentioned also the losers content, which could be easier be reached by direct democracy. I was wondering if this depends, I mean, it obviously depends, but at which degree it depends on the issue and how contested the issue is. And in this context, I would be interested, you had very recently a referendum on COVID measures in Switzerland. And as this is such a controversial issue, I was wondering if you would say that this really led to a higher losers content than government measures. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great questions. Yes, of course, there's always a risk that direct democracy, get abused by political parties. But my answer is, well, but that's just something you have anyway also with electoral democracy. So this is a general problem of lobbies and interest groups, etc. So it's not something that applies only to direct democracy. But I agree that you need, for instance, it's important to have some rules about financing of referendums. Who pays for that, to have transparency on that, and that's something that's probably the most problematic aspect of Swiss democracy, that we until now do not have this transparency. But there have been, thanks to direct democracy, a popular initiative demanding transparency in campaign financing, etc. And I was actually a member of the committee of that initiative. So sometimes I'm also a bit activist for some things in favor of democracy. And what happened is that the parliament in June, they proposed some kind, we say, counter proposal that goes some way towards what we have asked in the popular initiative. And so we withdraw the initiative because we were happy with the solution of parliament. So there is some advancement in this issue in the Swiss context. The question of losers' consent, well, the thing that you mentioned is actually a great example, the COVID. So we had this referendum in late November, which was actually about the COVID law that introduced, among other things, the certificate. And so, as you know, there was a lot of opposition against that, a lot of manifestations, etc. But what you do see is that after the referendum, all these, public manifestations, like a little bit violent as well, they kind of disappeared. and I was reading yesterday newspaper now, the group that was against the COVID law, they start fighting among each other, people going out. So it could be actually, it was used, sometimes this was used to say that direct democracy can be problematic for some social movements, because it does allow you to create social movement, you want a referendum, etc. But then if you lose, yeah, but okay, that's the part of the game, and the question is, do you prefer to have what you had in France with this gilet jaune? It was this yellow, how do you say, gilet? Yellow vest, yeah. That you had, sometimes also very violent, not all violent, but there were some violence with burning cars and destroying, etc., etc. On a topic that was, the trigger was the French government decided to increase some tax on gas oil, etc. So, in the Swiss context, you would have had a referendum against that, and then people decide, and then if those who were against the increase lose, well, they have lost, and that's it. So this is the kind of. At the same time, I'm very much in favor of people going out of streets, active citizens in this way. This is also a way to express this. But at some point, there is some point where this can turn in violence, in open conflict that can be problematic for the stability of democracy. And from this perspective, I see also direct democracy as a kind of a way to pacify in a civilized, democratic way, and still allow people to have disagreements, but in the end, there's a decision taken by voters, and that's it.
Yes, thank you. This is called in legal sociology literature the social pacification function that we attribute also to civil juries. The juries with referendums are, there's sort of very Republican kind of institutions, direct democracy-like, and this is a main function, this pacification, the safety valve, if you want, function. So, any other questions, please? I think we have time and space for just one more question, probably, if there is one.
I have a question for Daniel, just a short question. Have your participants in Budapest be paid for participating? Because out of or per diem or whatever, and how many days was it? I lost that. I missed that information.
Thank you for the question. I forgot to mention it. Yes, so they were given a per diem for 4 days, 10,000 forint, which is about 50 euros, maybe a bit less. So it's not a huge sum that they were given for a day of participation, but maybe it can be considered as an incentive to consider it as something as a work. And one of the participants talking about the process mentioned that in the end of the process, of the 4 days process, he felt like he was really working for his money. So he considered it not as a free time activity, but like a work that he was committed to. And I think it was a very interesting contribution from this participant's part, that talking about citizens' participation as an activity that can be compared to a work that is paid. And it was that was also, it was said by this participant during the conference. So there was also a discussion about it during that conference. So I find this very interesting.
So it was 50 euro per day or for 4 days?
Per day.
Up around 50 euro per day. Okay, thanks.
So, right. They weren't paid by George Soros, by any chance? No, I'm just joking, of course. It's a bad joke, I hope. Okay, so I think that's it. Thanks all to all for this first session that has now concluded, Perspectives on Democratic Governance. And now we will have to move directly to session number 2, Democratic Governance once again within the European Union.
Again, good morning to everybody. You can now see only 2 persons. However, there are more persons who have worked for the papers that we are going to listen now. The session, as Professor Papadopoulos already announced, is on democratic governance within the European Union. So we are continuing more or less on the same topic, but now with some more nuanced, maybe, papers on democracy itself. So the first speaker actually is Dr. Anastasia Deligkiaouri, who is next to me. She is a senior researcher at Dublin City University in Ireland, however, originating from here, Thessaloniki, from the Aristotle University. And she's going to present a paper written not only by her, but also by Professor Papadopoulos and Dr. Kyriakidis, who are both organizers of this conference. The title is The Rise of Procedural Legitimacy of the European Union under the Juncker Commission, the Impact of the Better Regulation Agenda. Dear Natasha, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning. I'm very happy to be here again after quite a long break that I'm in Ireland. I mean, I continue to be in Ireland, but I was very happy to be invited in this conference. For this specific conference, which I think it encompasses a number of different aspects about democratic governance, EU politics, and the new issues about COVID and the pandemic and how was regulated and managed throughout the pandemic. So as Lina said, I'm going to present a paper which is co-authored by me, Alexandros Kyriakidis, and the director of the Center for the Study of Law and Democracy, Professor Ioannis Papadopoulos. So a little bit about the background of this paper. So actually, it's a paper about to be submitted to a special issue at the Journal of Public Deliberation. And the special issue, the main topic, which addresses about the legal aspects of the deliberative system. So a number of scholars, either coming from a legal background or the political science background, trying to address some aspects of the, of the deliberative democracy and deliberative theory, but from a different perspective, paying attention more to legal aspects, how issues of law interfere in this procedure, and some other topics that usually in political theory are not that developed in terms of deliberative systems theory. So the specific paper combines perspectives from legal theory, political theory, EU politics, and it also extends part of my research that I have done as a Marie Curie Fellow at Dublin City University. So we have tried to provide a theoretical framework, develop further theories about legitimacy and how procedural processes and how the procedural legitimacy plays a critical role in democracies, taken as a case study, not more in a empirical sense, but let's say more in a theoretical perspective, the better regulation agenda of the Juncker Commission, as we believe that it has enhanced the role of deliberation and participation also in relation to citizens. And it has also provided another aspect of an enhanced legitimacy throughout the policy cycle. So that's quite a long paper with a great theoretical development. So I will try to highlight some of the aspects and the main cornerstones of how we develop this argument and the conclusions we reach in the end, but of course still in progress, and there's much discussion about all these issues anyway. So the aim of this paper is to examine the impact of participatory and deliberative practices in EU decision-making process on the EU legitimacy using the revamped better regulation agenda of the Juncker Commission, which was again revised in 2015 as a case study. So we conceptualize and we analyze legitimacy at the EU level through the common 3 criteria of input, throughput, and output. And we argue that while the 2017 Better Regulation Agenda has enabled citizen involvement throughout the policy cycle of the EU, there are still shortcomings in establishing a deliberative mode of public engagement. We find that, as it happens in most of the initiatives of the Commission, that there is a clear tendency towards increasing participatory and deliberative practices at the EU level. And that was specifically enhanced during the Juncker Commission. On the other hand, we see that this throughput seems to have an increased importance in the EU, although there is still room, I would say, for improvement. So we don't consider that all this, as I said, these expectations were fulfilled in the end. And I think there is still much room for improvement. There are still issues to be taken into consideration also by, in generally analyzing how the EU works. So there are, as we know in EU studies, there are many theories, there are many different approaches on how the EU works as a system, or how it can deliver, which are the priorities, and whether it should be focused on input or output. There are a whole different approach and a whole different understanding of how it should work. So it's kind of a difficult, let's say, task to combine the deliberative processes that are open and less, let's say, focused on this structure that the EU has, and try to somehow include them in this difficult system that it's already difficult to work. So the paper disentangles issues of legitimacy in the European Union decision-making procedures by focusing on this agenda. So we discuss issues about the legitimacy as these are analyzed in the literature, and we also focus on how the democratic deficit discussion has been shaped in the EU. These are issues that are inextricably associated, because most of the discussions and most of the kind of solutions that come up try to address this deficit, whether from some scholars accepted in a specific sense or not. So we argue that we consider the EU policy-making framework as a kind of quasi-deliberative system with several participatory instances, still to be discussed whether they are adequate and they can really deliver to this perspective, and the fact that it includes different levels. So within this multi-level governance that, of course, has its own expectations and challenges. We focus on two main points: the issue of legitimacy, which is the essential element and precondition in lending power to the decisions made by institutions, and the importance of procedural legitimacy specifically as a series of actions and subsequent decisions valid and legitimate. So as legitimacy in democracy is rooted in public will, we believe in a notion and understanding of legitimacy, not moment-based. So it's not only based in elections, but it should expand throughout the policy cycle, throughout the 3-year electoral cycle, where citizens and all major stakeholders should be given the possibility to articulate their arguments, to participate, to have a substantial discussion, and to this extent have a say, as we used to describe that in the decision-making, the process. As of course, this has its own perspective in the EU framework, where we know that it's not only citizens, we do have the member states, we do have specific structures. We know that the architecture of the EU is very specific and unique in terms of how it works. So trying to inhibit all these characteristics in the EU is, I think, a challenge. But from my perspective, from my study the last years, I think the EU has made significant steps towards reaching this deliberative process. And now that's not relevant to the paper per se, but we are in the middle of the major participatory process in the EU. And it's in the context of this also, I mean, the conference in the context of this perspective, so the conference for the future of Europe. Still, we have seen very good results so far, but I don't think we have reached the level of participation that was supposed to happen. So let's go back to the paper. I'm just trying to correlate what we're doing with the current procedures that are underway all over Europe. So in our study, we engage with the principle of procedural legitimacy. This is developed by Fuller with a particular emphasis on the idea of procedural due process. which presupposes effective citizen participation, involvement, and deliberation decision-making process. Then we try to see and scrutinize the current state of participatory deliberative legitimacy in the EU under the prism of the well-known input, throughput, and output model, as this was developed further in EU studies. So actually, we take a more systemic approach, as this was initially developed by Easton and then was developed and supported further in European studies. We consider EU a broad democratic system, as we said, that it operates at various levels and stages, involving also different actors in the formation of policy making. So I don't think I need to go further to analyzing what input, throughput, or output is, just a few words about each one of them. So the whole approach, of course, is constitute a systemic approach to deliberative democracy. We focus mainly on throughput and the importance of including throughput in these procedures, emphasizing and enriching how this is conducted, and also securing all these criteria that would make throughput more constructive, because in relation to institutional throughput, the so-called constructive throughput, as Smith says, requires productive deliberative interrelationships among actors in the wide variety of throughput governance processes that make up the coordinated discourse of the policy sphere. So a number of different things. Regarding the theoretical part of the paper, mainly authored by Ioannis, so that is a very rich theoretical framework, which actually develops the democratic theory of law and Fuller, and the importance of law as a social phenomenon, and the fact that we're talking about law and the purposiveness of rules that has two main actions, a direction giving and a means ends, the importance of rule of law, and behind that, the importance of and the demand of justification. Because in this sense, we can have acceptable principles of legitimization. In the book of Morality of Law, Fuller defined the legal system as the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to the guidance and control of general rules, introduced the idea of internal morality of law, which according to him consists of 8 procedural requirements for any legal system. So the formulation of sufficiently general rules, their public promulgation in sufficiently prospective terms, in clear and intelligible language, free of contradictions, sufficiently constant through time, so that people can order their relations accordingly, pragmatically possible, and applied in a manner sufficiently congruent with the other written formulations so that people are able to follow them. So the core idea of procedural due process, that individuals actually potentially aggrieved or adversely affected by public decisions must be given the possibility to effectively participate and to be heard. So the possibility of having a fair participation of all stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process, and that have this possibility of being heard when actually they are affected by this process. So the value of participation is very important. And I think that's what makes a clear connection with what we're discussing about deliberative processes and the formulation of better regulation agenda. And also a hearing presents a valued human interaction in which the affected person has the opportunity and the satisfaction of participating in the decision that vitally concerns them. So, and fair participation in the decision-making process is an element of procedural legitimacy. It's a moral and political value in the first order, which implies that the legal processes are value-laden. So the number of different things that we develop in the paper, also in relation to eunomics, and the fact that I will actually conclude that, which is a very rich part of the paper on how the conceptual development goes. So the importance of justification in terms of law, and the fact that anyone and the stakeholders who are affected by decisions, so the whole community should have a say, and this should take place in the principles of fair participation and justification. And then we move, and also just to clarify that we're not talking about procedures that are merely technicalities. We're talking also from the perspective of legal rules that are that are substantially, democratic and substantially challenged and can be really discussed. So we're not talking about only formal procedures, but procedure per se has a formality that should be maintained as well. So we should not neglect the fact that some issues should be present, should be presented, safeguarded against perhaps something else. So in terms of the input, output, and throughput, we know that legal scholars have emphasized different aspects of this model and how Smith has developed the importance of throughput. So it's either output, so we can't really be very, not receptive, but the EU, the way it is on more a technical perspective, can't really rely on input, but has to be effective in terms of its outputs. So that's the more output approach, that the more democratization of the EU would lead to perhaps less efficiency. Again, an argument which is actually challenged. In terms of the input approach, there's of course a huge disagreement in the gap between the input and output perspective. Sometimes there are connections that we can really establish in that, is that the input of citizens is necessary to produce proper output. So that's actually a precondition. It doesn't come in contradiction with that. And the democratic legitimacy, does not only stem from the aggregation preferences, but on the other hand, including the aspect of deliberation, and this continuous deliberation among institutions, people, and in general, the governance in the EU would actually instill democratic legitimacy and strengthen it further. Of course, here emphasis from this perspective goes also to the strengthening of powers of the European Parliament, which were already strengthened from the Lisbon Treaty. And it focuses also on the quality of governing processes of the EU, and focuses on the institutions' efficacy, accountability, inclusiveness, transparency, and openness. And I will not go further in issues of that because we already know them. I will just try to correlate them to what we have used as a case study. So all these principles in the revamped 2015 Better Regulation Agenda. The Better Regulation Agenda is not something new. It was just revised by Juncker Commission, but with a whole new framework that has enabled participation of citizens and any major stakeholder, any stakeholder in general, in the whole policy cycle of the EU. So before any laws are put forward, so before the Commission actually decides about them, after, and there's also the revision process, so somebody can also have a say on that. Briefly, all these principles that we have discussed in theory and are also developed in the EU studies framework are reflected at least, or let's say promised in the Better Regulation Agenda. I would say in terms of the structure, they are reflected on how the procedures are running. So there are two parallel procedures that are taking place. So if we see that in a more practical sense, yes, citizens can actually post their comments. They can have a feedback on the whole policy cycle, but there are many things that we need to consider further. So through all right, yes, I will try to conclude in 3 minutes. So using this framework of inputs, throughput, and output, we see that initially this precondition of inclusiveness, somebody can say that it is fulfilled. In what sense? In the sense that no one is excluded. Everyone has internet and can participate and have their say, either providing a comment, right, or either filling in one of these structured questionnaires. So anyone can participate. There are, of course, other issues to consider. Who knows about this initiative, whether there are these preconditions to participate, and whether there is the knowledge and literacy for somebody to be really substantially involved in that. In terms of throughput, I will keep the 3 minutes, Lina, don't worry. Citizens' involvement in the agenda, as I said, is either posting a comment or in any language. So you can also see the comments of the others. It's quite difficult, but at least there is this visibility of comments and kind of transparency. In terms of transparency, when there is a major stakeholder like a company or whoever that represents somebody needs to register with transparency register. So also transparency is one of the major, at least, principles that somehow is served. Still, there are contradictions of that. But on the other hand, when we don't really see the major public consultation because it takes the form of a questionnaire submitted to the relevant DG. So not only the DG knows the answers, no deliberation takes place. In terms of output and the potential impact, so the DGs are responsible for that. They take the results included in the impact assessment that accompanies the legal act. It's very hard to find it, to be honest. And it's very difficult for a common and ordinary citizens to reach about that. So we can say that according to the scholars that have also analyzed the agenda, it's not really purposed to include people in that, ordinary citizens and participation. However, it enables this participation. And I think if it was developed further as an initiative, it could have been more effective. To conclude, it is clear that the better regulation agenda strengthens the elements emphasized by throughput, primarily accountability, transparency, and stakeholder participation. So the whole legitimacy framework of the EU was somehow strengthened and, let's say, reach another level in terms of how citizens can have a say of that. There are still shortcomings acknowledged from the Commission. The new von der Leyen Commission has also included the better regulation agenda in one of its priorities in terms of democratic change. So it still remains, and we hope that it will remain one of the priorities, and also a modus operandi in the EU. Yes, and they consider the legitimacy perspectives transferred within EU studies through the throughput approach, an element that can offer valuable contributions to a more efficient democratic governance in the EU. The connection between procedural legitimacy and throughput opens new avenues for cross-disciplinary research. We know that it's a very fertile ground for discussion and cross-deliberation. And we hope to see many more instances of, let's say, approaches and perspectives and willingness. We have seen that from the EU in terms of deliberation and for operating a system which many more stakeholders can be involved, so the final outputs are informed of citizens' interests and demands. Again, that's a very rich paper, and I hope my co-authors are, satisfied with the short presentation. I very much want to thank them as well for their cooperation and for the invitation to this conference, and thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deligkiaouri. That was really an all-encompassing paper concerning the three modes of legitimacy. I think we can barely skip any of the three modes. I think all of them are useful in one way or another. I will now move to Stefan Lütgenau, who is founding director and head of the Foster Europe Foundation, based in Austria, a foundation for strong European regions. Stefan is going to present a paper on the transnational participation in the framework of the European Union macro-regional strategies, based on the example of the EU strategy for the Danube region. Stefan, would you like to share your screen with us?
No, in fact, it's not necessary, as I do not use a presentation. I would just speak to a brief talk, if you allow me. So thank you very much for the organizers to invite me to this conference. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be present in Thessaloniki, which I would very much love to do. I would like to present a small case study on transnational participation as an element of democratic governance, and I will focus on the transnational participation in the EU strategy for the Danube region. I would like to briefly present EU macro-regional strategies and the Danube strategy, as I'm afraid not everybody is acquainted to this model of cohesion policy in Europe. I would like to take a closer look to the potential of these strategies for transnational participation or participatory approaches. Then I would have a brief look into the status quo of quality of democracy and governance and trust in the area we discuss, the Danube region. And then I will analyze the participative practice in the strategy, and finally try to suggest some reasons for the situation as described. A macro-regional strategy, by definition, is an integrated framework endorsed by the European Council, which may be supported by European structural and investment funds, among others, to address common challenges faced in a defined geographical area relating to member states and important third countries located in the same geographical area, which thereby benefits from strengthened cooperation, contributing to achievement of economic, social, and territorial cohesion. The macro-regional strategies are the third EU framework for cross-border cooperation in European cohesion policy, after the financial support programs, of which you may know Interreg as the most prominent, and the legal instrument European Association for Territorial Cooperation, the EGTCs. So far, we have 4 macro-regional strategies: the Baltic Sea Strategy 2009 founded, the Danube 2011, the Adriatic Ionian Sea region founded 2014, Greece is taking part here, and the Alpine region, the macro-regional strategy for the Alpine region, established 2015. In order to ensure a stronger political dimension, macro-regional strategies are based on a strategic document endorsed by the Council of Ministers that defines clear priorities for cooperation, and these priority areas are then implemented in concrete terms within the framework of steering or action groups, in which mainly members of the public administration work on projects and exchange of experience, problems, and solutions. There is also a provision for politicians to coordinate regularly at the macro-regional level in order to facilitate political implementation. Although macro-regional strategies are not intended to create new funding, institutions, or rules, the famous 3 no's, they have potentially far-reaching influence. Macro-regional strategies unite quite diverse actors in new cross-border networks and define thematic priorities for cross-border development. In doing so, they also have an influence on EU, national, and regional local policies. Their direct anchoring in the European institutions and accompanying participation of the European Commission and steering by the European Commission facilitates access to EU funding. In addition, they offer a forum for renegotiation of established relations between the various territorial levels, even in a cross-border or transnational manner. Macro-regional strategies thus have some kind of redistributive and regional political effects. Cross-border cooperation has developed from a niche topic into an independent policy area in the European Union in the last few decades, with the creation of financial support programs and legal opportunities. The number of cross-border associations in the EU has increased significantly. At the same time, cooperation has increased in quality. Today, cross-border structures not only represent a framework for the discussion of common problems, but also draft medium and long-term development visions through projects and political declarations. The resulting networks mobilize EU funding, influence policies, and negotiate relations, as I mentioned, between the territorial levels. As a result, participation in cross-border cooperation is increasingly becoming a criterion for influence and financial opportunities. The development of cross-border cooperation away from experimentation towards the relevant policy field raises scientific interest, while in the first area, functionality of cross-border cooperation was in the foreground. Now there is a shift to questions of democracy and legitimacy. Sorry. To illustrate, EU macro-regional strategies are affecting 220 million people in the European Union and beyond, 19 EU member states and 9 non-member states, of which 7 are candidate states to the European Union. Therefore, macro-regional strategies are, next to the cohesion inside the European Union, important to bridge the gap between neighborhood and enlargement policy. With a focus on a governance reform, they provide a tool to bring candidate states closer to EU standards and methods of good governance. The Danube region is unique because it's quite heterogeneous in terms of macroeconomic performance, with the lowest performance found in the European Union and in the candidate countries, and with Austria and Germany performing the highest on the socio-economic indicators. Relations between most parts of the region are quite strong, and macro-regional integration on trade, investment, and energy is found to be high. There are large variations throughout the region when it comes to competitiveness, with a notable divide between urban areas, capital cities, and the rural regions. Concerning the performance on political governance, on political democracy governance and institutional indicators, the region appears to be divided too. So let's have a look at the status quo of the quality of democracy and quality of governance and trust in the strategy area. As reported by the Commission 2017, political governance and institutional indicators in the regions are divided. Hungary, a politically and geographically central player in the Danube region, applies openly an illiberal, increasingly authoritarian regime with a rapid shrinking of space for free media, shrinking civic space, and a high level of corruption and nepotism. Reports from Transparency International, the Bertelsmann Quality of Democracy Index, reports from the Council of Europe, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the European Parliament, and last not least, the infringement procedures by the Commission against Hungary illustrate the status of governance and democracy in the country. Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovakia have been shaken in the past years by massive street protests leading to a change in political parties ruling, the formation of new parties, and increasing awareness of corruption and nepotism as a basic challenge to good governance and democracy. While in Slovakia, measures against corruption had been taken after the murder of Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, a long political wrestling ousted the highly corrupt post-communist PSD from government in Romania, and the conservative gap also linked to numerous cases of corruption in Bulgaria from power. Just to illustrate, estimates by investigative journalist groups go as high as 14 billion euros channeled away from European funds for Bulgaria only. In EU member states affected by corruption, the weak situation of the judiciary is the other side of the coin. The blocking of the European Public Prosecutor's Office by Slovenia and Hungary illustrate this, I guess, perfectly. The recent, in this week, presented report by the European Parliament on cooperation on the fight against organized crime in the Western Balkans named corruption in a widespread organized criminal manner as the main feature for failure of governance, undermining the democratic institutional processes for the Western Balkan states. Furthermore, the report rated systematic corruption of the political class as the main reason for the brain drain, the exit of young people leaving their home countries. Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro are participating states in the Danube strategy. The non-candidate states of Moldova and Ukraine do not present a picture any better. Moldova experienced 2020 and 21 this year the first real change of government with the new president, Maia Sandu, elected in November 2020, and Prime Minister Gavrilia, in office since August this year, are not only seen by their compatriots as politicians who promise to finally take action against corruption. Last month, in November, a high-ranking conference took place in Berlin, how to achieve a fundamental transformation with a focus on Moldova, which shed light on one of the key problems of the region. Democratization without a functioning judiciary is not possible. but the judiciary cannot be part of a solution while it is part of the problem. Therefore, the new government in Moldova wants to subject all higher judicial personnel to an extensive asset check. These financial circumstances, the financial circumstances of those affected in real estate, cars, bank accounts, spending behavior, lifestyle, should be examined and put into relation to the official salary of the persons examined. This affects 700 public prosecutors, more than 400 judges, and also their closest relatives. As stated by the Prime Minister, there is a great shortage of professionals, and not just in the judiciary. Where should the heads for renewal come from when around half of each year's group people leaves the country after graduating from school? While there is a clear north-south slope in quality of governance and democracy, corruption is not only a problem in the southern Danube region or in the Western Balkans. I just point the finger to the recent multiple changes in government, the accusation of corruption and abuse of media here in Austria, which led to the decline in trust in state institutions from positive 64, means very good or good in 2018, to less than 41 positive in the last week. So what about the participative element of the Danube strategy? Where is the participative element to be found? Well, EU macro strategies by design follow an open approach. They, at least in theory, invite all parts of society, state and non-state, business, civil society, academia to participate on all levels, transnational, national, regional, and local. And as part and instrument of the EU cohesion policy, macro-regional strategies follow the place-based approach, defined as one of the basic features of cohesion policy. Place-based approach means collaborative long-term approaches to build thriving, vivid communities delivered in a defined geographic location. And this approach ideally characterized by partnering and shared design, shared stewardship, and shared accountability for outcomes and impacts. Shared means business, organized civil society, citizens, academia as partnering stakeholders. Place-based approaches are often used to respond to very complex and interrelated or challenging issues, including social issues impacting those experience or the risk of disadvantages and very often natural disasters too. So according to this, EU's macro-regional strategies are by design open to stakeholders with the open approach. They are open and need participation according to the place-based approach they have to follow. And last but not least, according to Article 11 of the Treaty of the European Union, which I may quote, the institutions shall by appropriate means give citizens and representative associations the opportunity to make known and publicly exchange their views in all areas of union action. And second, the institutions shall maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with representatives and associations and civil society. Open, transparent, and regular. Well, cohesion policy and the livelihood of EU citizens. The cohesion policy is, I think, next to the consumer protection, one of the most visible and tangible policies in the European Union. Cohesion policy has a direct effect on the livelihood of people, new roads, wastewater management, energy supply, educational, cultural, administrative facilities, as well as tourist facilities. In the Danube region, cohesion funds take a large share of the entire public infrastructure investment. At the same time, EU funds have been criticized increasingly of fueling corruption and stabilizing illiberal regimes. Take a look at the example of Bulgaria I gave you before. We have seen the impact of organized civil society can have on regime changes and the strive for rule of law, ending corruption and higher quality in governments and democracy. The structural involvement of civil society and other non-state stakeholders in the strategy can contribute to widen the scope and control of local, regional, and national discourses and procedures of decision-making. Providing a strong backing from the transnational level via Commission, European Parliament, and the participation of member states, the macro-regional strategy can contribute to enhance quality and degree of participation on the national and subnational level in the participating states, member states and non-member states. With a transparent and participative approach, the macro-regional strategies could contribute to stabilize good governance, trust in institutions, ownership of local population, and the quality of public investments in the Danube region.
Noch 2 Minuten, bitte.
Oh, I have to speed up a bit. Other than expected, when we look at the participation established in the strategy, the draft for the strategic policy paper of the strategy 29-2010 did not foresee any participative elements or structural participation. The open approach was communicated but not efficiently applied by the Commission and by the participating states. To illustrate, the strategy was formed by a sequence of 5 conferences held along the Danube for 2009-2011, which is supposed to perform a fora on channel for opinion building. In 5 two-day conferences, the speaking time devoted to civil society was 1.3%. So it was an independent civil society initiative that formed a group of NGOs from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, demanding regular, structured, transparent participation of civil society in the strategy, and did an intensive lobbying. After a long period of disregard, in 2014, the network started to do a first civil society summit connected with the annual political summit, the so-called Danube Participation Days, which demanded regular, transparent participation as necessary. And this participation day was demanded to be institutionalized, and in fact it was after 5 years, and it found after 5 years the support, at least by some of the member states, and political support by the Commission. I leave a number of problems out. A key change was 2019 too, when the Baltic strategy took over the model of the Danube strategy of participation days, and the model became more popular and more widespread and more accepted. Nevertheless, quite a huge part of the structure suggested is still and was still under the radar, so to say, of the decisive institutions.
Thank you.
Let me try to illustrate why the situation is as described and why participation is not accepted, not established, and missing. I would name a number of...
Mr. Lütgenau, the time has now passed. Could you please conclude in 1 minute?
Yes, I try.
Thank you very much.
The main reasons is a lack of interest, a lack of knowledge. There is no clear definition or clear main misunderstanding what is participation, a lack of capacity on both sides how to deal with it. Very importantly, a lack of a public in the Danube region. We don't have a European public, and without a public sphere, democratic participation is a problem. And there's a mismatch of the EU macro-regional concept and the political and governance culture in the region. The macro-regional strategy needs to have transnational approaches, while the people acting are in line ministries, making their careers in line ministry, and do not think out of the box of the line ministry. Yeah, that was my main part, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lütgenau. That was a very interesting example, I think, on what we have previously discussed on more theoretical terms. And without any further delay, I'm now passing the floor to Professor Despoina Anagnostopoulou. She is a professor at the University of Macedonia here in Greece, and she is going to present us a paper on European Union media and information literacy policies in order to enhance democracy. Professor Anagnostopoulou, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me in this extraordinary conference, which is financed by the COST program. And I would like to personally thank Professor Papadopoulos and Professor Papadopoulou for inviting me in this session. So I would like to remind you what were some of the remarks made by the previous speakers. And this was participation for all and civil society. But the question that I'm going to deal with is, are we ready to participate in civil society and participate in dialogue in public forums? So my topic is about EU media and information literacy policies in order to enhance democracy in the European Union. So my point is that we have to be informed and we must have information and media literacy skills in order to understand what is the information we get from so many channels, from internet, from social media, from newspapers, and to know who is behind. Are there any people behind the channels that we don't know about? And do they mishandle news? Do they create fake news? So European citizens, and we are all European citizens, may participate in the democratic life of the European Union by voting for the European Parliament, the European co-legislator, joining public debates, submitting European citizens' initiatives that can change the EU agenda, or using digital platforms usually created by the European Union in order to submit our opinion. Digital transformation through the EU digital agenda since 2010 has significantly contributed in European citizenship, since citizens' participation is greatly facilitated by using digital platforms. So our participation is enhanced. Therefore, access to reliable and fact-based information is crucial for making sound decisions and participating in civil society and electoral decisions. For participation to be meaningful, citizens must also be able to form their own judgment. They should be able to make electoral choices in a public space where a plurality of views can be expressed freely, where sources of information can be accessed freely, where free media, academia, and civil society can play their role in a stimulating open debate, and where there will be no malign interference, either domestic or foreign. I will present and evaluate the policies of the European Commission for media and information literacy as tools for the ongoing construction of a digital democracy public space in the European Union. But what is information and media literacy? What skills should we possess? What is the new thing, the new challenge that we must meet? Well, media literacy has been described as the ability to access the media and have a critical approach towards media content in order to create communication in a variety of contexts. Media and information literacy is a set of competencies that help people maximize advantages and minimize harms from the plurality of information that we get. Media and information literacy covers competencies that enable people to critically and effectively engage with communications content, institutions that facilitate this content like platforms, and use of digital technologies in order to submit our opinion. Media and information skills, otherwise MIL skills, are indispensable today for all citizens, regardless of their age or background. And after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in 2020, the EU prepared a defense against disinfodemic, as the Seoul Declaration calls fake news. But what is the Seoul Declaration? The Seoul Declaration was adopted last year in November, and in the framework of UNESCO, in order to declare media and information literacy in continuation of its previous efforts. The Paris Declaration on Media and Information Literacy in the Digital Age was adopted in 2014 by UNESCO. The Riga recommendations on media and information literacy in a shifting media and information landscape, and the UNESCO Global Framework for MIL were the foundations for this Seoul Declaration. So media and information literacy was a core competency for addressing the disinfodemic, and MIL contributes to access to information, freedom of expression, protection of privacy, prevention of violent extremism, promotion of digital security, combating hate speech and inequality, promoting diversity, particularly as it relates to the ability of marginalized people to create and disseminate content which expresses their worldview. MIL is also in conformity with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially Target 10, access to information, of Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. The EU law has all the necessary framework in order to promote digital and media literacy. First of all, one of the core values of the EU is democracy and freedom and equality and respect for human rights. This includes respect for media freedom and pluralism and the right to freedom of expression, and requires continuous efforts to protect free, pluralistic, and independent media. It also establishes three fundamental principles of democratic equality, representative democracy, and participatory democracy through European Citizens Initiative and the dialogue with the civil society. The Charter of Fundamental Rights protects also the freedom of expression in Article 11, which includes the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and share information and ideas without interference by a public authority and regardless of frontiers. The EU legislation as well has two basic instruments. It is the Audiovisual Directive of 2018, which has amended the previous directive of 2010, and also the Council Framework Decision of 2008/913 of 2008 on combating certain forms and expressions of racism and xenophobia by means of criminal law. Especially the Audiovisual Directive, we will see that promotes media literacy. And it has also used soft tools such as the Voluntary Code of Practice against misinformation by online platforms and media like Facebook, Google, and Mozilla or TikTok, and the Digital Education Council recommendation of 2016 for the increase of digital competence levels among learners of all ages. So this Media and Audiovisual Services Directive describes media literacy back in 2018 and states that media literacy refers to skills, knowledge, and understanding that allow citizens to use media effectively and safely. In order to enable citizens to access information and to use, critically assess, and create media content responsibly and safely, citizens need to possess advanced media literacy skills. And this literacy should not be limited to learning about tools and technologies, but should aim to equip citizens with the critical thinking skills required to exercise judgment, analyze complex realities, and recognize the difference between opinion and fact. It is therefore necessary that both media service providers and video sharing platforms providers, in cooperation with all relevant stakeholders, promote the development of media literacy in all sections of society for citizens of all ages. The directive established the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, which is composed of representatives of national regulatory authorities or bodies in the field of audiovisual media services, and the Commission representative participating in these meetings. Among its tasks is to exchange experience and best practices on the application of the regulatory framework for audiovisual media services, including on accessibility and media literacy. So the European Commission in 2020 has prepared a defense against this infodemic and fake news. It has adopted the European Democracy Action Plan, which empowers citizens and builds more resilient democracies across the EU against rising extremism and populism, in order to promote free and fair elections, strengthen media freedom, and counter disinformation, including imposing costs on perpetrators. The Media and Audiovisual Action Plan, which aims to help the sector recover by providing media companies quick access to liquidity and financial support, assisting their digital transition, and empowering citizens to easier access of media content and its critical use in order to take informed decisions. The proposal on the Digital Services Act is the third pillar for promoting the media and information literacy. It aims at modernizing, inter alia, the legal framework on social media platforms and imposing transparency obligations, at providing for redress mechanisms, and at establishing uniform procedures for reporting illegal content procedures and regulating platforms' liability. And fourth, the Digital Education Action Plan, which aims at enhancing our digital skills and competences from an early age in order to promote digital literacy, at developing common guidelines for teachers and educators, at providing high-quality user-friendly content in secure platforms, at updating the European Digital Competence Framework to include artificial intelligence skills, and at establishing a European Digital Skills Certificate, the next certificate that we must all have in a few years. So the European Democracy Action Plan prepares citizens to participate in the democratic system and builds on the lessons learned from COVID-19 crisis. It includes measures on electoral integrity, media freedom, media pluralism, and disinformation. And there are three aims: to promote free and fair elections by regulating transparency of sponsored political content, that is political advertising that is sponsored by someone that we don't know. We need to have transparency in order to know who sponsors this political advertising, and providing for the liability of online platforms and advertisers because of false false content. To strengthen media freedom, for example, by recommending measures to tackle safety of journalists and by financing projects on their legal and practical assistance. In this context, the EU will enhance its support to media pluralism and improve monitoring of the transparency of media ownership and state advertising. To counter disinformation is the third aim, by strengthening the obligations and accountability of online platforms in the framework of the above-mentioned Code of Practice on Disinformation, and by introducing rigorous monitoring and oversight and countering foreign interference, including imposing costs on perpetrators. We already have one recommendation under this European Democracy Action Plan. It was adopted in September 2021, and it is about ensuring protection and safety and empowerment of journalists in order that they are protected by member states with a support system which will rapidly respond and will issue early warnings for problems of misinformation. And the code of practice against disinformation is also very important. It has been the world's first regulatory instrument with which the digital industry has agreed on a voluntary basis to self-regulatory standards to fight disinformation and ensure greater transparency and accountability. We all remember how Facebook and Twitter has taken down the false allegations of President Trump that the elections were not politically correct, and the result was not fair. The Code of Practice sets out principles and commitments for online platforms and the advertising sector to counter the spread of online disinformation in the EU, which its signatories agreed to implement. Here we see that this code was accepted by Facebook, Google, Twitter, Mozilla, as well as by advertisers. In October 2018, later, Microsoft and TikTok became signatories. Now, new signatories are signing this code of practice since the European Commission has embraced this code of practice, included this code of practice under the European Democracy Action Plan. So there will be new commitments, transparency in political advertising, closure of fake accounts, best practices, and by the end of 2021, that means in the coming days, there will be increased monitoring and transparency measures and broader participation.
3 minutes left, please.
How much? 3. Thank you. This is the Media and Audiovisual Action Plan, which helps media to recover. And it is EU money that is given to the media so that no other will give money to the media and influence their content. And here is the proposal for Digital Services Act. It has many things, many provisions. This is only a proposal for the moment, and it tries to build on the Code of Practice on Disinformation and regulate online intermediary services, and provides for uniform procedures for reporting illegal content and platforms' liability for users' unlawful content. And here is the Digital Education Action Plan, which covers the period of 2021 to 2027. It aims at enhancing digital skills and competencies for the digital transition and transformation of education systems. It will promote digital literacy and tackle disinformation through education and training by developing common guidelines for teachers and educators who will be trained to be digitally competent and confident. It will also finance infrastructure and high-quality user-friendly content in secure platforms. And most of all, it will update the European Digital Competence Framework to include artificial intelligence skills and establish a European Digital Skills Certificate. Conclusion. The European citizenship is a unique world example towards global citizenship at regional level. And it is based on us, on European citizens, that we have to be informed in order to use our opinion. So the EU uses its powers and its legislation in order to promote media and information literacy and tackle fake news, extremism, and populism, algorithm, autocracy, which all endanger EU values and European society. The measures envisaged by the 3 action plans on democracy, on the audiovisual sector, and on digital education are accompanied with financement from the culture program of the European Union, and in combination with the Digital Services Act and all the EU legislative mosaic, for example, on hate speech, will eventually attain the objectives of media and information literacy and meet in a uniform way the challenges of the new digital era. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Professor Anagnostopoulou. As always, you touched upon a very topical issue, a very hot issue that is upcoming. And you suggested, together with the European Union institutions, of course, some I would hardly say solutions, but some modes maybe to face the phenomenon of infodemic, as you said, or fake news and all the problems that the very useful technology of the internet brings with it, because we have to keep in mind also the positive side of things. So now I'm giving the floor to you, to the audience, who is either here in the room in Thessaloniki or with the help of Mr. Kyriakidis also on our Zoom meeting. So who would like to either pose a question to the speakers or say your own opinion? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself, your name and who you are, and then you can speak.
Hello, my name is Lina Katsanouli. I am a political theory master's graduate, and my question goes to Stefan and Mr. Stefan Lütgenau. I found your case study fascinating, this micro regional strategy, very with great potential. And my question was whether you think that structuring society with regard to this micro regional place-based strategy could eventually undermine the essence of the state altogether, and whether you think this would be desirable to move away completely from a Westphalian model into this completely new structure of a resource-based society. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let us collect some questions if there are more, and then I will give the floor to the speakers. Are there any other questions or interventions? Alexandros, can we see the Zoom if there are any questions there? On Facebook, so we are not following there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Sofia Demerouti. I'm graduate student in the University of Peloponnese. I would like to ask a question to, I'm sorry, don't know the name. Sorry.
It's okay.
The last
Deligkiaouri, Anagnostopoulou.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate all for your insightful speeches. Do you believe that the new European Action Plan might limit the freedom of speech in the social platforms that we all know is a fundamental value for the European Union, and enable censorship? Thank you.
Okay, that's a hot question. Anybody else who would like to take the floor? Professor Papadopoulos, yes, please.
Thanks. My question goes to dear Despoina Anagnostopoulou as well. I was impressed by all this array of measures, very dense array of measures. I'm mostly interested in the soft law part of the measures. I would like to know if there has been built in some means of intermediate evaluation of the soft law measures, such as, for example, the ethics code under Maria Gabriel, the commissioner. Has there been something going on as to the evaluation, and what has been provided as to the output? What is going to happen with the output of the evaluation? And concerning the evaluation, are there NGOs, civil society organizations, feedback mechanisms provided for, more specifically? Thank you.
Thank you, Ioannis. Anybody else in the room? Yes, please. So it's on the micro, please.
Okay. Now it's working, yeah. So my name is Sérgio Barbosa. I also would like to congratulate for the last presentation about media literacy. And my question is about a long-term perspective, how European Union can also make the plan that you showed as a conclusion, but thinking a way to foster digital literacy for the youth generation. And I mean, teaching from the age, from the elementary schools, for example, how the platforms works, and then they are growing up knowing about the ecosystem of the GAFAN. For example, you have experts like Josef van Dijk that bring the discourse to the social values and how we create new scenarios beyond the dominance of GAFAN, that Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. But how we can have these sessions to foster media literacy, but from the stage of the elementary school, high school, and before going to the bachelor and the university. Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to the three speakers. If you want, I will start again with the same order as you spoke. So, Natasha, you have the floor if you want to comment on something, on what has been heard.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't think I have a question to answer, but overall, I think the three presentations very well combine this perspective of participation, and also in relation to our paper, what Professor Anagnostopoulou said. So a basic precondition is for somebody to know in order to participate. So usually political scientists and people addressing issue of participation focus on the procedure per se. But on the other hand, in order for people to participate, you need to motivate them. You need to provide them an incentive, and they need also to know. And another part probably of media literacy might be the fact that there is a lack of European project literacy. So, and I think the fact that many people don't really know what's the European project about, the structures, the institutional architecture, is actually a problem in participating. So even if they're allowed, and if there is a perfect platform providing all the functions in order for somebody to participate, is user-friendly, it allows for all kinds of participation, still it will remain inactive if people don't know about that, and if they lack the digital skills to do that, and if also they are in a an environment, an information environment that has several problems like disinformation and all these kind of things. So we need to have an all-encompassing approach when we're discussing issues of participation. Is not only providing the tools, is not only providing the legislation, but it's also making sure that the whole environment is encouraging participation, and it also allows people to participate even if they want to, but it provides also the skills to do so. So that was my overall comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deligkiaouri, and I'm passing the floor to Mr. Lütgenau.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure that I understood the question correctly, but I'll try to answer and do my best. And if you allow me, I would like to have a remark myself too. Is the way I described undermining the national state? No, I don't think it's undermining the national state. It is making the borders and what borders mean in Europe more permeable. So we do have functional regions that do not overlap with the national boundaries. To give an example, the capital of Austria, Vienna, is 40 kilometers from the capital of Slovakia, Bratislava. And this is a functional working region that is interactive and has an integrated labor market, integrative health services, integrated tourism, and trade market. And when we had the Corona closures, this was interrupted and none of the sites were functioning well. So these transnational, trans-border cooperation coordination with a participative approach is not undermining, but strengthening the subnational levels and the European identity and European integration, I think. Yeah, it is important to know as a Bulgarian citizen or as an Austrian citizen somewhere in a remote area that other people fight with the same problems and other people perhaps develop similar or even better solutions, and you can cooperate and coordinate. This is behind the project, so it's very much strengthening the entire project of the European Union and the European integration. If I may come up with a remark to Despoina, thank you very much. Very interesting. When I apply this, what I heard and what the European Union is providing here to the region I work in, it is very much making the thief to catch the thief, as misinformation, propaganda, fake news are not coming from some remote social media or unknown account, but from public TV. Yeah, think of the anti-Soros campaign. This is state-owned and state-forward campaign that is anti-Semitic and completely false. And there we have to take measures, and there the European Union is extremely weak, because of course it's in the hand of the national government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this input. And last but not least, you have 4 minutes to answer the questions for which you would need normally another paper to give, but please be as brief as possible. Professor Anagnostopoulou.
Thank you very much for your questions and your interest in my paper. Well, Professor Papadopoulos, you submitted a very topical question. Well, who reports on whether this code of practice against disinformation is really applied? Well, there are 3 actors. The first one is the European Commission. So the European Commission reviews everything. And how does the European Commission find the information for reporting? It is second, the platforms that give information and report what they have done during the whole period. So there are reports from the platforms, there is a report from the Commission, and there is a report from the European Regulators Group of Audiovisual Media Services. In addition, there is an expert group on media literacy. So they also are involved in this process. However, there is no civil society group, no NGO that reports on, officially reports on the misinformation on online platforms. So I hope I have answered, and I would like just to add that one major topic that was treated by the platforms and the Commission is the pandemic, and which vaccine is good, and whether we should be vaccinated, whether it is dangerous, and so on. So the Commission has dealt with all these issues, and now this code evolves more into a better monitoring system, because for the moment it is only self-regulatory instrument. So we hope that these fake news about vaccines, which are only opinions and are not facts, will be somehow reviewed. So this is the first question. The second question is about censorship. The European Union, the European Commission, when adopting these action plans, has also thought about the risk to the freedom of expression. Everybody should express his or her opinion, and there should be no censorship. So the compass in all this is the case law of the European Court of Human Rights and the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. We have this Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 11, and this will be implemented. So there will be no censorship. And if there is censorship, there will be courts, there will be these regulators who monitor media. So we will not be, silenced, yes, or muted. The third question was about the digital education and media literacy. And the European Commission envisages to start enhancing these skills even in kindergarten. So even the young children have to be trained to media literacy, since they are free to, in most cases, to find information on the internet. And there are some modules which have not yet been prepared for the European Union. I have found them in the United States by an institute on digital education, and I have seen them. There are instructions given to the teachers what they should do, that they will give, let's say, an announcement and discuss with the students on who has written this announcement. Is it correct? Do we know the person who has written the announcement? Can we trust him? And then check the content. So there are already modules on how to teach this at school. And it will start from kindergarten, elementary school, secondary school. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, everybody, all the three speakers, and of course, the people who have also prepared the papers, and especially all of you that you are here with us, and the people on Facebook who are watching from home. So now we have a break, and we will meet after 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we start with session 3 of today's conference. Deliberative democracy across the world is our topic. And Professor Dobrinka Chankova from the Southwest University Eleftheria in Bulgaria will elaborate on the topic of deliberative democracy practices and human rights in a state of emergency, the Bulgarian landscape. Professor Chankova, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. Dear audience, of course, I'm very glad to be here. It's clear. Thanks to the organizers. Now you will see what a short presentation means. But do not rely very much on this because I am a lawyer. However, many things have been already said, and I have to skip part of my presentation. And the most important thing, I think, is that to speak about democracy in Greece, so you are more or less saved if you are warned timely. So my starting point, which is our common starting point, I think, is that in a state of emergency, deliberative democracy and human rights are restricted, of course, inevitably. They have new dimensions corresponding with the profoundly changed people's daily lives, altered functioning of the societies. But however, I believe we are at one that the rule of law state, global management should always be exercised through discussion and shared responsibility. So far, so good. But the situation is a little bit different, especially today. In the COVID crisis, but not only COVID crisis. And going back to the main subject, in Bulgaria, we have had, and we still have maybe, a deep political crisis, which further affected democracy and human rights and constitution-making process. I have some observations from abroad that peculiarities of emergency state led to the establishment of total control of people's lives, and they, of course, object. And even yesterday, I attended from outside a demonstration in the center of Thessaloniki, and to the best of my knowledge, it was related to this. But no comparison with Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a specific case. We have also many restrictions, and I'm not very happy to say, but not on a proportionate mode. This is thanks, in brackets, to the COVID-19 pandemics. But at the same time, this event intensified political participation in my country, and with good reasons. I know that this well-informed audience do not need very much explanation, but I will try to remind you some important elements from the recent past, even today. This year, we had 3 parliamentary elections organized in Bulgaria, 3. And this is maybe, but be prepared. I will inform you about more records. On 4th April, regular parliamentary elections were held after nearly a year's street protest, be informed, different social movements and unrests against the politics of the ruling party GERB. New political actor appeared, the Populist Party, but this is not a dirty word, we already discussed this. There is such a people, ITN abbreviation, and they won, quite surprisingly, a second place in the election with their appearance during the first elections. But there is also one but. After these elections, no party was able or willing to form a government during the existing only few days 45th National Assembly, which had only 9 sittings. And the president called early elections in July this year and appointed a caretaker government. The early parliamentary elections were held on 11 July this year. Some people voted from Greece, some from Zanzibar, some Bulgaria, some didn't vote it at all, which is maybe not the best decision. And however, the new party, ITN, led by a showman, by the way, we are not exception from the recent trend, won the most seats in the 46th National Assembly. But again, and this time, not surprisingly, a government was not formed and many different scandals took place. By the way, because we are academic audience, I would like to inform you about the latest Bulgarian innovation. When we attack, not me, but on the political landscape, when somebody wants to attack the political opponent, usually they use plagiarism, academic work, etc., quite efficiently. So be careful for the future. And after these many scandals, after 2 months functioning, the parliament again was dissolved, unfortunately. The third parliamentary elections has been held very recently, just a month ago. The same caretaker, almost the same caretaker government was appointed, and for the first time, in Bulgarian history, we had voted 2-in-1 elections, where voters had to vote for president and the parliament. Okay, no problem. We managed this with machine vote, but we managed it. So, and what is the latest and greatest is that during the latest election, a brand new coalition named We Continue the Change, led by charismatic former caretaker ministers, became the first political force after less than 2 months existence, even without political registration, and after total failure of all sociological polls. Quite interesting Bulgarian landscape, I would say. But here I have to make a short analysis, enough statistic. Regrettably, most of these actions during the mentioned period were not implemented in a deliberative mode. The new Leaders' Party, as well as the established formations, taking advantage of the emergency situation, rarely or pro forma consulted constituencies and ordinary people while taking important decisions. Some people even said that we have a new form of conspiracy, to say nothing about deliberative democracy. I'm deeply sorry to confess this. Human rights, of course, suffered a lot. Civil activism faced many barriers, some inevitable, other unjustified. And the latest, and maybe the most important, is the analysis made by the European Commission, but for this, on European scale, but for the Commission, I will speak a little bit later. And now I will speak about the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. Probably most of you remember that in March 2020, Maria Pejčinović-Burić warned that COVID-19 restrictions had to be balanced with human rights. And the reason was the situation in Hungary and her letter to Prime Minister of Hungary, maybe you remember. She recognized that drastic measures are needed, but individual rights should be observed because they are in the European Convention of Human Rights. Derogatory regime, you know, some countries availed themselves, some didn't. However, the main message was that we do not need uncontrolled state, even in a state of emergency, and basic principle of democracy should be observed. But nothing from this happened in Bulgaria. She tried to ask for media pluralism. We have discussed this, the confidence in society, etc., etc. Unfortunately, Bulgaria is a specific case in many aspects. And now the Commission, European Commission reports, which are really important. As you know, after the accession of Bulgaria to the EU, our favorite fields, justice and corruption, have been monitored by the cooperation and verification mechanism, initially as a transitional measure, today still valid, and to our deepest regret, there is no significant progress. Here I will go a little bit further, but I think it is necessary for this well-informed, specialized audience. One of the long-lasting issues is the lack of accountability and responsibility of the Prosecutor General, to whom personality every Bulgarian, not only society, is very sensitive, even today. Many attempts have been made to restrict his vast competencies. Some good attempts were good, some not. One even passed in the very unstable political situation. But unfortunately, the Constitutional Court later declared many texts unconstitutional. So the situation is the same. Again, for Bulgaria, I have to say that yeah, corruption is everywhere, but come to see corruption in Bulgaria. In 2017-18, we undertook a reform, institutional legal reform, unfortunately declared not successful. And there is a lack of trust. Again, massive street protest, missing convicted persons from the upper election of power, and a lot of criticism coming from Brussels. The next is the absence of a regulation of lobbying, transparency and predictability of the legislative process in the country. And there is a vicious practice, maybe Bulgarian patent. I do believe that this happened nowhere, that with transitional and final provisions of ancillary laws, some important decisions are taken, eliminating any public debate. About media pluralism, transparency, attacks on journalists, the previous speaker has spoken enough and I will skip it. But just one good news maybe in the bad situation is that we managed to stop quite a risky draft law hampering civil society and forbidding functioning from abroad of NGOs so far, but let's see what will happen. The next part of my presentation was dedicated to infodemic, which is a big problem for Bulgaria. But the previously colleague spoken enough about, yes, infodemic. And I would like just to mention, not totally to skip it, to mention that in this online society, in these digital prisons in which we have lived many months and years, internet is really very important. Technology, information technologies are very important, but at the same time, they create room for inequality online and offline, and discourage the cooperation needed to face global challenges together. Today, the great, I'm sorry, a small mistake, potential of the internet is shadowed with misuse and abuse of information online. Disinformation, misinformation, fake information is a phenomena associated with information pollution, which I believe is a great danger for our society, because they aggravate stereotyping, misrepresentation, discrimination, polarization, and all factors that influence the prevalence of hate speech, which is quite typical, unfortunately, for Bulgaria. Near to the end, I have some open questions to the audience, because personally, I have no answer to them. And these questions are, how can we create consciousness from our own culture and world views of the need to overcome the infodemic for the sake of mutual understanding? Difficult question. How we can prompt innovative formats for intercultural dialogue as a solution to contain the spread of infodemic. I think we have to find fast decision of this. As a conclusion, because my time is expiring, I know, I would like just to point out again, I have given you some bad examples of Bulgaria, not because I'm proud of this, on the opposite, but briefly to give a warning signal to the progressive minds. And having in mind one very important aphorism that I would like to share, although I know you believe it, that the bad things are done not only by bad people, but by good people who observe but doing nothing. Here we have spoken enough about the active citizenship. I will not repeat the colleagues, but would like to finish on a most optimistic note. We see a light in the tunnel, tiny light in the tunnel, because please see, we have a brand new government appointed on 13 December, a few days ago only, and great hopes are invested in it. By the way, it is formed by charismatic persons, most of them finish Harvard, Yale, etc., young people, and they receive a lot of approval, of course, great expectations. Even the caretaker governments, we had 2 governments this year, did quite a lot to mitigate these problems with democracy and human rights in Bulgaria. Not enough, of course, but now my proposal is, let's give 100 days to the new government, but without stopping doing anything. We have to be active, of course, academic, NGO, etc., etc. Otherwise, if nothing happens, I'm pretty sure the civic society will be mobilized again. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Chankova, for giving us this picture of what is happening just next door to us. And and giving us hope that things will become better. Thank you very much. We continue with the next speaker, Assistant Professor Bashim Khan Asir. Okay, from Ernesto Cruz Ruiz, Doctoral Research Fellow at the Technical University of München in Munich, Germany, the significance of citizens' participation and deliberation in modern democracies, a view from Global South. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're Ernesto, you're muted.
Please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
No, he's doing it. There you go.
It's okay now, right?
Yep, great.
Okay. And you can see my slides and everything is...
Yes, all great.
But you cannot see me. That's my question.
No. Yeah, I can see you too, and the slides. Everything's fine.
Okay, cool. So, okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be a presenter in this conference. Sorry I couldn't make it. I was advised not to go there just for the obvious reasons that I think we all know. So I've been advised to give a 15-minute presentation as per the standard international conferences, and I will try to do that, and maybe we allow for some discussion. So let me begin by this. So just to brief you a bit of what I'm gonna do in this presentation is basically, I wanna cover 3 points. I'm just gonna give you a brief overview of what I consider the global north view on deliberative and participatory democracy, and also what I consider is like the conventional wisdom of democratic innovations. Then I wanna give you somehow as well what I consider like the global south perspective on deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, and democratic innovations. Basically, I'm going to present you somehow some of the perspectives we have from Latin America on the same regard. And then I'm going to conclude with just some brief on somehow like the amalgamation of these two views, what I call the global north-south vantage. I'm just going to put it like, I'm going to emphasize the role of circumstances, actors, and interests involved in participatory and deliberative democracy. So a brief head-ups. Probably this is going to sound a bit nothing new to you, so to say. I mean, I know you all are interested in these topics, at least these 3 main regards, like democratic innovations, participatory and deliberative democracy. So this might not be new for you. So probably this is something you have heard, and I'm going to be very broad, and I'm trying to give you some examples so you can digest it better. And probably also as a reminder, this is kind of part of a broader project I'm working on. So probably this is so the panorama is so extensive. Okay, let me go to the next. So I'm just going to start by this idea that I consider is like the main perspective coming from the global north. Basically, I'm just arguing like the first side or the first part of deliberative and participatory research has been mainly focused on justification. So probably just why we need, I mean, if I have to say it in some words, why we need citizens to take part in decision-making, policy-making, constitution-making, why we need them, and why we also need deliberation, right? So most of the arguments I argue fall down or can be summarized somehow in legitimacy, better decision-making, education, and democratization and political equality. Basically, what I'm trying to say, or why I say this, that most of the scholarship is going towards legitimacy. This is somehow something that we have been hearing all the time, and probably since democratic institutions were established, it all boils down to legitimacy, right? So are we able to consider that the decisions that are made by some group, let's call it elite, or like as Chankova said in the last presentation, probably shall we believe that just because they come from Ivy League universities, they do more legitimate decisions, better decisions? I don't know. That's a question that we all have all the time, right? Probably also some of the other characteristics of what has been researched so far has also to do with collective decision making, right? So we, as scholars studying participatory and deliberative democracy, we always tend to say like, okay, we have, we have some benefits of including more citizens and deliberate them with experts and politicians and the broad public, because we can reach better decision making, right? So we can achieve informed decisions. And we also have other aspects like what Pateman was telling us also from the 70s, 60s, and it was echoed many times also, like if you make citizens participate, probably this is going to have some kind of democratic effects on them, and probably just to foster and to achieve more informed citizenship that can deal with problems of democracy, like informing themselves and selecting right politicians and so on and so forth. Probably another point that I'm working on is also this democratization process, right? Like, okay, we need citizens to participate, also to make the process of the transition from authoritarian to more democratic regimes more smooth, and probably more speed and more rapid, so to say. And also we have this the common, what it has been somehow popularized in the maybe 10, 20 years, this idea of the political equality, right? So you can make participate citizens because, you can have this trilemma, right? So you have political equality, you have mass participation and deliberation. And probably this is something that it's gonna be a problem for more of the designs that we have. But you can achieve some kind of political equality with some mechanisms like deliberative poll and so on and so forth. So basically, I'm arguing just this. This is the standard vision or the conventional wisdom of participatory and deliberative democracy. Then, of course, another of the aspects of this status quo, so to say, is the design, right? So we have all these designs. We have like many publics, deliberative polls, as I was mentioning before. We have maxi publics, we have participatory budgeting, we have planning cells, we have all these mechanisms, right? So we have somehow achieved some kind of a broader understanding of what are the benefits of participatory and deliberative democracy, and then we have somehow applied them in form of democratic innovations, which are these new institutions or these new mechanisms or new processes or updated institutions that can be more enhancing, like more welcoming to citizen participation, to their contributions, to their deliberations. So we have all these gracious and kind of very useful mechanisms, right? And we know that we can use them in many forms, and there is plenty of research. But still, I think like the deliberative, the democratic innovations still are engaging with the same problems of what was telling us the participatory and deliberative democrats, right? So you can use them to boost citizen participation. You can use them to increase legitimacy and decision making. You can use them also for all these collective or collective decision making, and all these processes, right? So this is somehow, and that's what I want to say, somehow reminiscent of the broader research. And even in this event, we have listened many of these arguments, like, okay, so you need citizen participation for making citizens understand what are the stakes in a pandemic situation. You need citizen participation, or you need to educate them. You need to make this technological divide more shorter. So you have a lot of potential in the uses of citizen participation, if I could use that term, the use of citizen participation for achieving some democratic goals or ideals, and also to make them understand what is at stake. So at the same time, I think, and that's what I'm arguing, so somehow it's like we also know the risk, right? So we have all these problems all the time, like even in every new piece of research, not saying that that is bad, but we are always repeating the same kind of risks that, like I cite here, like safe selection, manipulation, tokenisms. We also have these degrees of manipulation or tokenism, like the ladder of citizen participation, which is a piece from the 70s. So basically, this is what I'm trying to understand. So why we are somehow not giving or making the next step. And we also, just to give you an example, we have the deliberative poll, we have the deliberative polling in Porto Alegre. So basically from the deliberative poll, we can say, okay, so we know that we can sample randomly, we can create a pool of citizens, then we can recruit them, we can make this randomization, we can give them information, we can put them to discuss and to deliberate, we can have another set of discussions or plenarizations, and then we can really prove and test that citizens can really engage, regular citizens can engage in political decision making, they can contribute to decision making, and that we can do wonders, so to say, with them. We also know by the research that we have this deliberative polling, so you can engage even like citizens that are living in slums or they are living in favelas, so you can really make anyone, so to say, participate. So that is part of the status quo. And also we have reached somehow this kind of broader understanding of when and why citizen participation is public, and differences are the effects of different political systems on citizen participation and deliberation, right? So you have some more welcoming regimes, you have some more exclusive, you have more inclusive, so you have different roles of citizen participation and deliberation. So this is somehow status quo. We even, and we can further this discussion or these examples with examples of citizen participation, even debating very controversial topics like abortions and others, right? So even we have in the latest, like very top-down organized deliberation and participation, we have these forms of citizen participation and deliberation that take long. There are government sponsored from the top down. So we know by now, so to say, that this is possible, that this is feasible. So now what I'm asking myself also, and this is also part of this presentation, is like, what is next? Is democratic participatory and deliberative research really at its limit? Is there something else more to say about it? Is something of what has been said in the scholarship on deliberative and participatory democracy only about the same topics like justification, designs, and feasibility? I think we should go down that street, but then we have all these other guys like Bartels and Aiken, that they are saying like, okay, people are still very manipulable. You can kind of exercise some control over them. They have short memory. They cannot really follow politics. They cannot really, or they do not have any definition of democracy. You can also find these kind of arguments with Fukuyama, like, okay, everything boils down to identity. You cheer for and you root for your team, and that's it. People do not engage in groups bigger than 100. We don't care about the common good, and so on and so forth. You can find also these other arguments like democracy, that they are somehow participatory and deliberative democracy, but they say, okay, these mini publics, these mechanisms of participatory and deliberative democracy, like we have been arguing for or cheering for, they are just kind of esoteric mechanisms. Nobody really needs that. We need more participation and allow these kind of mechanisms to go. With this, I want to say, and I still have some minutes left, that we need to take more seriously these mechanisms, like to kind of push forward the limits of the research on participatory and deliberative democracy. What I see so far is like The guys that I present, like Lafont, Fukuyama, and Bartos, of course, they are doing all the kind of research, and probably they are very disputable what they've been saying. Is that they are really not taking seriously the research that we're doing, right? So that is my perspective, and I see some kind of risks on that side of the research, right? Like if we really do not take more seriously what we are doing in regards, like there is something more than justification, the science and just the feasibility, we might fall down again to the views of, or maybe we will see other voices and kind of embracing Schumpeter's view, like this view of the leadership and the competition, and we just need the best elites or the Ivy League guys, the technocrats leading the country. We don't need citizen participation as long as we give them some economic benefits, or as long as the economy is doing good. We will not need to engage them in decision-making processes and so on and so forth. So basically, we will end up with this electoral mass and some kind benign or beneficial elites, like they are giving some pieces of bread to the citizens, and we are all happy, right? But my point, and sorry, I'm going to extend maybe a couple of more minutes. What I'm saying is like, okay, so as in the case of the participatory voting in Latin America, and all these examples that most of the times are quoting our guys, like if you see some of these pieces on global citizen assemblies, they all justify also the use of more deliberation and participation, because they cite examples, I don't know, from Brazil, from India. They cite participatory democratic innovations and in the most remote places on the earth. Like they say, okay, you see, guys, we need to engage more with our research because it is possible. And I will say, yes, sure, that is nice. But you need to also to look at what is happening, for instance, in the region of Latin America. So according, and this is why I put this graph that you might be seeing or observing right now. This
we
is
can't hear you well. Please repeat what you said. We can't hear you very well, yes, because you're explaining quite interesting things.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. So now what I'm saying so far is that we need some kind of what it has been done also by some Latin American researchers, right? Like gather all the democratic innovations you might find, place them in time, give us more information about the context, and then let's explain what is causing these mechanisms to emerge. Why is that important? Because I think what is missing in our research as scholars on participatory and deliberative democracy and democratic innovations is this sense of what is going on, a sense of the context and the timing, and why we need this kind of citizen participation mechanisms. Somehow what you were saying also when it comes to the European Union, so we know, and I think the European Union can fund many more mechanisms, and the European Union, and from the top they can give you money and can give us money and do research, and we will be repeating basically the same things. And now this is what I'm saying, like the global South perspective, at least for the case of Latin America, what we can learn from that perspective is like we have plenty, at least 3,000 or 4,000 undocumented democratic innovations in the region. This is what you're seeing in the graph. Most of them, they are backed by the government, and most of them are not binding, and so on and so forth. This description, it can be done in Europe or anywhere else if you have enough information, right? But what you cannot see in any of these descriptions, what you cannot see, and you can even mention these examples of democratic innovations, you can say, okay, we need more digital aids, we need more technology, we need to crowdsource policy making, we need to crowdsource constitution making. You can say all this, but what you cannot see in any of these databases or forthcoming databases or so on is like what I call also the depths of democratic innovations research, which are also applicable to participatory and deliberative democracy. Basically, what I'm saying is the cause, the interest, and the actors with the political agenda. For instance, what are the stakes when reforming institutions, or what are the stakes when creating new institutions? We know already that, as I was saying at the very beginning, that there's some epistemic gains when you increase the citizen participation and deliberation of this, right? But and you can say, okay, this is also possible in even in polities with great number of citizens. But what is missing, this is some of my main arguments, is that we are missing the causal mechanisms of what is driving the emergence of these democratic innovations or participatory and deliberative democracies. That is what is missing. And for that to be done, of course, we need to continue kind of researching democratic and deliberative instruments of decision making. We need that, but we need also to condense them somehow. Maybe, probably, I'm exaggerating, but somehow, as the economists do with the models of demand and supply of goods, right? Something in that regard. But basically, what I'm saying also as well is like any of these new explanations, or probably also it can be applied to single cases. We need to know more about the context. We need to know more about the actors and the political agendas of the actors. If we cannot, if we don't account for those characteristics, it is probably, it is not gonna be dual, but it's gonna be repetitive somehow. So we need to account for economic shifts, for regime change, for globalization, for probably I don't know, maybe I'm not an expert in the European Union, but probably it is, why is the European Union not a federation? Probably you need more discussion. Probably there are lots of interest involved that you need to account so you can explain why it's changing or not changing something. So basically what I'm saying with the global north-south vantage is basically we need to focus on context, temporality, actors, and interests. We need to have, in the sense of deliberative and participatory democracy research, we need to transit from ideas and mechanism to interests. We need to also somehow reflect on these ideas of self-government and also have an emphasis on the local level. And something that is also coming from the South, at least just by description of the database that I mentioned, Latino, and the graph that you saw, is that implicitly, they don't say it explicitly, but you can read them between the lines that all these mechanisms, all these democratic innovations have to do with the common good and the public reasoning. So basically, yes, while in the North you say, okay, we need more citizen participation for legitimacy purposes or to make better decisions. In the global South, they say, okay, we need citizen participation and deliberation, but because we need better sewage, we need hospitals, we need schools, and we need these public goods, and we need deliberation and public reasoning to get things done. I think this is also a complementarity in those two global north-south vantage. And that's it. Sorry for taking a bit longer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Cruz Ruiz, for your well-documented research that was presented here. And I would like now to open the floor for questions. Who would like to ask the first question?
So we just have two presentations. Sorry for the interruption.
There are only two presentations, yes.
Oh, no.
This is why you had so much time. Because it was...
No, sorry. Then I have a question, maybe just to start. Like, for Professor Chankova. So you were mentioning these Ivy League guys, and that's also something that I reference while presenting. So you think, I mean, this is an open question. You don't really need to reply. I mean, it is just nothing. But you think like technocracy is somehow what Bulgaria needs nowadays, or is this something that should be my recommendation? This is a very open question again.
Just to clarify, technocracy or democracy?
In this case, because you mentioned that some of the new guys who are going to be forming the government, they studied at Yale and Harvard.
Yes.
And that's my definition of technocracy.
I will try to answer, although it will be quite ambivalent answer. First of all, I would like also to say that I'm ready to accept all questions to my pretty sad presentation, plus obstructions, plus proposal, plus condolences, if necessary. But however, we are building our democracy again from authoritarian regime again and again. We are not the avant-garde of the world, definitely not in general. Quite conservative minds are Bulgarians. But what is really good is that we are pretty good in technical matters. For example, e-democracy, especially before the pandemic and so on, was pretty well developed with public consultation portals, with different deliberative channels, etc., etc. Plus, we had a very specific virtual room, Megdan, which in Bulgarian means agora. It was a very, very, very useful mixture between technology and democracy. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, all this was suspended, of course. But nevertheless, Bulgarians are pretty good, not only as hackers, but also in many other technology things. And I do believe that we will manage to use the positive effects of internet, social networks, etc., and all technical innovations to rebuild again democracy in pure sense. Of course, we suffered quite a lot, as I mentioned, from fake news, from disinformation, but we also have the right to be forgotten, the right that has been proclaimed by the European Court, the Court of the European Union. So I believe not in technology's genius of the Bulgarian, but there are some good abilities in most Bulgarians. Maybe I'm one great exception from this, but I believe this is the right direction. This is the right direction, e-democracy. We will manage more with e-democracy than in usual representative direct democracy. We tried with 3 referendums several years ago without success. Any success. The parliament, the last parliament were pretty conservative, but e-democracy is something different. And I think we have to be progressive. So thank you. And I really rely on this direction of development.
Thank you, Professor Chankova. And would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. My question is kind of also linked to the Bulgarian presentation, but I think it is a more general one. You talked about an infodemic, and before we had also this discussion or the presentation about EU media policies, and then the question if this couldn't be a form of censorship. And I think this is an interesting question for us dealing with democracy. In principle, I would say social media, or the possibility for more or less everybody to publish something broadly, is democratizing society. And I also think that skepticism against government policies, including now also health policies, could be seen as a sign for active citizenship, for people who are actually say, okay, we do not just accept what is coming from above, we are thinking about that. At the same time, obviously, we have a problem here, and we have fake news and whatever have you. But so my question would also be, I mean, how would you deal with that? I mean, I really think that, as opposed to the situation in youth, when we had like mass media and they were telling us what to think and what to do, it is more democratic. So in a way, it comes back, I think, to what I mentioned in my very first question about this active citizenship. And I was really fascinated to say active citizens are not necessarily democratic citizens, which is true. But how do we deal with that? And I think this is really, it's a general question for all of us. And I ask it because I don't have an answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a general question. This is also a tricky question, and I will try to give only one perspective, and maybe the audience will add something. Yes, you are absolutely right in all your points. Yeah. Unfortunately, with our 111 place of the media freedom, according to the last, it's quite problematic. Plus ownership of the media, which most of them belongs to the belonged to the ruling party. And even during the election campaigns and etc., they serve them, not the new parties, the old parties, the status quo. And it was really a devastating fact. And many people were really very skeptical about all this, and that's why they didn't vote, etc., etc. But I believe in freedom of expression. I believe in the freedom of journalists. It was mentioned that the European Commission has already taken measures, and my personal conviction is if something wants to be really decided, throw it to the journalists. Throw it to the journalists, they will find the right way and to solve the situation, to clear the picture and to solve the situation honestly, although sometimes painfully. But I really think that the media is a partner and social, although with social networks, we have problems. Definitely we have problems with these nicknames, because we can't start investigation, for example, because of the anonymity, etc. I have dealt with this issue more or less. It's a problematic, but this is not something that could not be dissolved. So we simply have to find the right measure between the freedom of expression, between the objectivity. No, I wouldn't say political purposes. Political purposes are easy, are clear for everybody. And I think that it's a long-lasting process. Definitely it will not be resolved in the next days, but have in mind this, we have a new situation nowadays. And I also, maybe, I hope I'm not too naive, but I trust quite a lot to the new people, to the young people and so on. And they started with cleaning the situation, and I believe without catharsis it will not be possible. Probably not. Again, we will have to suffer a catharsis, but at that moment, I can't see another process. If somebody has another idea, I will be very, very glad to listen to it.
Anybody else would like to intervene? Mr. Giannopoulos?
Thank you, Professor Anagnostopoulou. First of all, I would like to thank both speakers for their insightful presentations. And my question goes to Professor Chankova. Yes, again. Since you mentioned before in your answer that in your country you are at the point that you're trying kind of to rebuild democracy, I would like to ask, what's the role of youth in this attempt? Like, are there any possibilities for representations like youth municipal councils or even youth networks? What's the possibilities that youth have in your country? Thank you in advance.
Oh, it's quite personal question, but I will answer. First of all, as a university professor, I'm teaching human rights, and I'm trying to infiltrate in my students the culture of observing human rights and democracy as the best option where human rights could be implemented. Secondly, I'm a chair of NGO. And as an NGO, we are also working in this field. As an NGO, also we are a part of a bigger network. And we participate in these different initiatives. For example, not only protests, but also included, but legislative process, public consultation, deliberation of new legislation, especially legislation, because I'm expert in this field. But so I think I'm doing my best. I'm not passive. And trying to mobilize, I have people, I have quite a big network, but still not enough. Honestly, still not enough. Come to Bulgaria to help us.
You will certainly will. So, any other question, Dr. Deligkiaouri?
Yes. First, again, I would like to thank both paper presenters for actually emphasizing on the context. It's important when we're talking either for democratic innovation, social deliberation, to take into consideration that each country has a different context, the way the regime works and the democratic or not structures. But my question or kind of point of discussion goes to Ernesto for his presentation about democratic innovations in the global south. So you were discussing the scholars that have a different opinion. And of course, there's criticism about that, about democratic innovation. So Christine Lafont, I think her main point is that it might be quite incompatible or contradictory to have deliberation in mass democracies because it doesn't really allow for many people to participate. And because these small democratic spaces are actually designed for small audiences of participation, and whether, you know, this kind of decisions they make, they can really be legitimate or reflective of the mass and the public. So I think, again, just a point of discussion, the main response comes from deliberative systems approach from Mansbridge and Parkinson. So how we can expand and how we can proliferate this kind of democratic participation and deliberation across the system. So many more people will have the chance to participate. And also I think the new direction that probably can combine this kind of approaches, because when we're talking about democratic innovations, it's not a substitute to representative democracy. It's actually a new perspective, and it can perfectly be combined, is how we can institutionalize them. So in a way, as you say, that whatever they decide has an impact. And in most of the case might be that there are top-down procedures. But for example, you mentioned Ireland. Yes, it comes from the parliament, but the parliament then should take into consideration the recommendations, and it has triggered several referendums that have actually amended the constitution. So the better designed they are, and the more well thought they are in terms of how they can be incorporated, I believe they can produce an output. And of course, there are several criticisms we have to take into consideration while we're evaluating and watching these innovations. So thank you.
Mr. Ruiz, could you please answer?
Yeah, thank you. I mentioned this Lafont and the other examples. Just I'm not really focusing on it. I'm somehow trying to make sense of my main argument, right? Like basically, I'm saying that yes, we have all these super nice and justified and already improved designs. And how come, that's some of my question now, how comes that if we have all those instruments are not being replicated or if not institutionalized, at least used more frequently to complement representative institutions, right? So this is my main motivation. Why is this happening? And of course, as I was saying, I also think like, of course, we can evaluate the contributions of these complements to representative democracy from a systemic perspective, something that you already mentioned. But still, why? My question is not answered, right? So we can argue in favor of this use and complementation of representative democracy by democratic innovations, but I don't see why, for instance, the crowdsourced constitution making of Iceland did not really pass the test of the legislature, and why, for instance, other similarly crowdsourced processes like the constitution making of Mexico City really made it to saw the light, so to say. So this is my main question, like why we need to, we can, of course, we can evaluate the failure of the constitution making of Iceland from a deliberative systemic perspective. And of course, we find benefits of this failure, right? And we can even, if we achieve a successful, I don't know, participatory budgeting in Germany, probably that could be also considered a failure from a systemic perspective. So I'm not engaged with why is this gonna be complement or not. The only thing is that I don't see why we need to be arguing about the contributions of for protests of biased media if we have the deliberative perspective or systematic perspective. My point is like, okay, so let us account for what is happening in some circumstances, like across regions the situations is different. Like in some regions there is citizen demand for democratic innovations. In other regions there are like the citizens do not really care, but they get these innovations. So I'm trying to make sense of the context and the timing, as I was saying, like different circumstances affect differently the political actors. And of course, every political actor has a different political agenda. So this is really what I'm trying to say, like, is this, if this is a complementarity of democratic innovations that are complementarity to representative democracy, that is really not my concern. I think we all agree, at least in this panel and the conference, that this is something that is going on and it might be complementing forever, right? My thing is like to explain why in some cases we can see or expect more democratic innovations and why in some cases we can expect less. There is no democratic innovations database for Europe, but I guess there are less. This is just I'm hypothesizing a lot, assuming probably too much. But I assume that there might be less democratic innovations in Europe than in Latin America. And why would that be the case? Because my argument and my theory will be like, or my hypothesis will be like, because in Latin America we had these kind of regime transition, and we had also these economic reforms like the Washington Consensus and all these characteristics. So that is why we could expect more democratic innovations, or more reform, or more complementarity of representative institutions because of that context and that timing, which is something that we cannot really, and probably I'm just speaking so on the air, so to say, or just building castles in the air, because we don't have the data to make such analysis. This is basically my argument. We could analyze the context and the timing, but we don't have that kind of information so far. At the moment, we just have Latino, which is like, or Participedia, or the consensus conferences in Brazil, but still there is no such degree of comparability. Probably we should engage as a research strand or scholars on this research strand to make these kind of efforts to make that kind of comparisons and evaluations. And thank you for the question. That was great.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Please take the floor.
Thank you. First of all, my name is Niklaus Tsiapalas, and I'm a postgraduate student from the University of Macedonia. I would like to thank you all for your very well-prepared presentations. And I would like to pose the question to Professor Chankova. My question is, to what extent has the Europeanization process, not only of the state institutions, but also within the Bulgarian society progressed so far after 14 years of being a member of the European Union? In other words, how do Bulgarian people feel about the European Union, and how do they picture themselves inside the European family? Thank you.
This is not one question, but however, I will try to answer. If I miss, please remind me. So I think we have to be very grateful that European Union has accepted us in the family. Thanks to the European Union, and sometimes thanks to the push from the European Union, we achieved quite a lot. Honestly, not freedom of movement, honestly, not funds. This is not the most important things. The total transformation of the public life and the personal life also, we owe to the European Union. This is not well understood by everybody. So there is quite a lot of skepticism in society also. But I would say that this is in a tiny cycles of societies that are directly affected negatively from some decisions. I wouldn't like to mention truck drivers and so on, issues, different small issues, but in general, taking the whole picture, I think that it's a great achievement that we are part of the European family. About the euro, for example, I'm skeptical also. I think it's quite early for us. This is my personal opinion, not being an economist, just as an ordinary citizen. Too early to accept euro last year as was declared. Next year as it was declared. Hopefully it will be reconsidered. But in general, despite of some quotas, despite of some restrictions, despite of some strict rules which we do not like very much to observe, I think our life was improved significantly, at least the life of the majority of the population. Of course, there are always some people that are dissatisfied, but they are not representative for the Bulgarian society. So I think we are going in the right direction.
Thank you very much for summarizing such a big topic. And do we have any other questions? Yes, there is one.
Oh, big interest.
Yes, of course.
And I have another question also for Ernesto. Ernesto, can you hear us? Yes. So how can we challenge in this global South mainstream about also innovation, democracy innovation that you showed in your presentation, with, for example, with a global South literature? I mean, if you want to make a good critique, how in some way these global South initiatives are located at the margins, how can you also explore a little bit more with maybe a decolonial approach, and how the global North can also learn with the lessons learned of the global South? So that's my question.
Yeah, I think you have a great point. I was also thinking about how we use the terms, right? And I think this global South perspective is like what we have in mind all the time. I think is like the periphery and the center, and how are the dependencies created, right? So I think that strand of literature deals with something different that I'm trying to say. But of course, I really have to think about that, the use of the terms that I'm engaging with. And I think when we talk about the global South and the northern perspective, we always cover this center and periphery, which I think I'm not engaging with that. Basically, my global South perspective is telling like, okay, this is how we understand democracy, and the global North or the established literature is how they understand democracy, right? Or what they are pushing for. And in my somehow my research, that's my point. Like the global North is all the time engaged with justifications, the improvement of designs, and with the feasibility of these processes. And basically, what they are using now is the global South perspective, just to say, okay, you see, we in the North are using these mechanisms, and we have the proof that in the global South, in the terms that they are using them in favelas or in India, in very indigenous populations or whatever situation, it works there, it should work in the North. That's basically what I understand when I read these guys. That's kind of my perspective, like, okay, yes, that is probably true. If you want to test your best designs in the global South, they will probably work. But in the South, the mechanisms are working, but the circumstances are different. And this is what I want. I was telling you, like in the North, probably this is like it is regarded as citizen or politician or top-down implemented mechanisms, right? While in the South, it's really like citizen pushed, and probably the mechanism or the dynamic is different. This is something that I still have to work, but I think, Sergio, that your comment is super well taken. I think the global South and Northern perspective is always about this center and periphery, and I have to think about that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruiz, and I would like to stop here, except if Professor Chankova would like to say the last word.
I would like only to thank the audience for the huge interest, although sometimes I was feeling crucified.
Well, we thank the speakers for answering all the questions and for their presentations. We thank you for your patience, and thank you very much. We have a break now, a lunch break. Thank you.